My daughter offered me cold, hard cash to stay away from her wedding. She slid a thick envelope across my scratched kitchen table and told me that my life was an embarrassment. She said a tired mechanic did not fit the elite aesthetic of the high society guests her wealthy new fiancé invited. I took the money without a single word of protest. On the morning of her wedding, her fiancé pulled up outside my rundown apartment. The moment he saw my face, he fell to his knees and started crying. What he told me next changed the entire course of our lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family. My name is Jameson, I am 70 years old, and I have spent my entire life building a legacy from the ground up. I possess wealth that rivals the most powerful men in the country, yet I choose to remain entirely invisible. To the world, I am just a retired African-American mechanic living in a cramped, grease-stained apartment on the south side of Chicago. I wear faded flannel shirts and keep my hands smelling of motor oil. I designed this life carefully. I wanted a quiet existence after losing my beloved wife Evelyn 5 years ago. I also wanted to see if the values we instilled in our only child had survived the corrosive nature of ambition. They had not. The reality of my daughter's character became undeniable on a cold Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my small kitchen table drinking cheap diner coffee when the front door swung open. Morgan stepped into my apartment without knocking. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how my health was holding up. She stood there in a pristine white designer dress, her heels clicking sharply against my cracked linoleum floor. Her eyes swept over the peeling wallpaper and the worn fabric of my armchair with absolute disgust. She looked at me not as a father, but as a stain on her perfect canvas. Morgan walked directly to the table and dropped a thick manila envelope right next to my coffee mug. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed in the small room. She crossed her arms and stared down at me. She bluntly stated that she was getting married in 3 weeks. Her fiancé was Ethan, a highly successful white tech executive who had just taken his company public. She bragged about the exclusive venue, the 5-star catering, and the guest list filled with venture capitalists and local politicians. Then she delivered the blow she had clearly rehearsed. She declared that a 70-year-old mechanic from the South Side simply did not fit her new elite aesthetic. She said her new friends would ask uncomfortable questions about my background. She claimed my presence would ruin the sophisticated image she had spent years cultivating. She pointed to the envelope on the table. She told me it contained $20,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. It was bribery. She was paying me to stay far away from her wedding day. She wanted me to disappear so she could step into her new life without the heavy burden of her past holding her back. She sneered as she mentioned that her future husband came from a lineage of generational wealth. She insisted that my calloused hands and working-class demeanor would only humiliate her in front of his family. She demanded my absolute silence regarding her upbringing. She had already informed her new social circle that her father was a wealthy expatriate living abroad out of reach and out of mind. The sheer audacity of her fabrication left no room for parental forgiveness. I looked at the thick envelope resting on the scratched wood. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the money back in her face or demand the respect a father deserves. My silence filled the cramped kitchen heavy and suffocating. I looked up at the daughter standing before me. I searched her face for any trace of the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders. I looked for the child who used to run into my garage, her face smeared with grease, laughing as I showed her how to change a tire. She was entirely gone. Instead, I saw a stranger consumed by vanity. I remembered the years I spent skipping meals so I could afford to pay her tuition at an Ivy League university. I remembered working double shifts in the freezing Chicago winters, my hands bleeding from the cold, just so she could have the brand-name clothes she cried for. I endured all of it because I loved her. I sacrificed my own comfort to ensure she would never have to struggle. Now she was using the very education I bought to calculate my exact price tag. She had decided that $20,000 was the fair market value of my absence. I reached across the table. My rough, calloused fingers grasped the smooth paper of the envelope. The weight of the cash felt like a physical manifestation of her betrayal. I pulled it toward me and placed it on my lap. I looked Morgan directly in the eyes and nodded my agreement. I accepted the bribe without uttering a single word of protest. My compliance was absolute. I knew any emotional outburst would only validate her distorted view of me. I chose to keep my pain entirely hidden behind a mask of weary resignation. She interpreted my silence as defeat. She believed she had successfully purchased her freedom from her own heritage. She was catastrophically mistaken. Morgan let out a long breath. Her posture relaxed and a victorious smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She turned on her heel and marched out of the apartment, leaving a trail of expensive floral perfume in her wake. The heavy wooden door clicked shut with a sharp final sound. The moment the lock engaged, my demeanor shifted completely. The tired mechanic vanished. I stood up, my spine perfectly straight, the facade falling away instantly. I pulled a sleek, secure smartphone from the pocket of my faded jeans. I dialed a highly encrypted number. My corporate attorney Mitchell answered on the first ring. I gave him a single, uncompromising directive. I ordered him to execute an immediate, ruthless background and financial check on Ethan. I needed to know every single detail about the man my daughter intended to marry. I had to ensure this white tech executive was not part of her malicious deception. If he was an innocent victim of her manipulations, I needed to know immediately so I could formulate a proper countermeasure. I demanded the full investigative report on my desk before the end of the day. The game had officially begun, and my daughter had no idea she was playing against the house. I would uncover every shadow in her life. I would strip away every lie she constructed to secure her place in high society. My name is Jameson. The heavy glass doors of the First Continental Bank of Chicago sealed away the city noise, replacing it with the hushed hum of old money. I stood in the grand lobby, my heavy work boots resting on the pristine Italian marble. I wore the same faded flannel shirt and grease-stained denim I always wore. To the elite patrons gliding past me in bespoke suits, I was entirely invisible. I was merely a relic from the South Side. I approached the teller station, ready to deposit the money Morgan gave me earlier this exact afternoon today. The young woman behind the glass took one look at my calloused hands and sighed. Her name tag read Chloe. She adjusted her silk scarf and asked if I was looking for the public transit coin exchange. I did not react to her blatant disrespect. I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and withdrew the thick manila envelope Morgan had given me. I placed it on the counter. I told Chloe I needed to make a deposit. She stared at the envelope with deep suspicion. She informed me that cash deposits exceeding $10,000 required special clearance. She pointed toward the exit and suggested I try a commercial branch closer to the industrial district. I did not argue. I reached into my wallet and withdrew a solid black titanium card. The metal caught the ambient light, entirely devoid of numbers or a bank logo. It bore only a single embedded microchip. I slid the heavy metal card across the smooth marble counter. Chloe picked it up with a condescending smirk. She swiped it through her terminal. The moment the system read the chip, her screen flashed crimson. Her smirk vanished instantly into pure and absolute silent dread. The color drained from her face as she stared at the terminal. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with sudden terror. She stammered a broken apology and grabbed her desk phone. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive suite swung open. Mr. Sterling, the regional bank manager, practically sprinted across the lobby. He adjusted his tie with trembling hands, his face flushed with panic. He bypassed the teller station entirely and approached me with his head bowed. He addressed me with utmost reverence and apologized profusely for the totally unacceptable delay earlier today. He glared at Chloe and instructed her to close her station immediately. He then gestured toward the private elevators. He personally escorted me away from the public floor and down into the subterranean levels of the bank. The private elevator doors opened into a soundproof vault reserved exclusively for the bank top-tier clients. Sterling led me into a private viewing room paneled in dark walnut. He offered me a seat in a leather armchair and asked if I required any refreshments. I declined. I tossed the manila envelope onto the polished table and told him to start counting now. I instructed him to deposit the cash directly into my primary holding account. Sterling opened the envelope and quickly sorted the crisp bills. He confirmed the total was exactly $20,000. He pulled up my portfolio on his encrypted tablet to execute the transfer. I watched the screen as the numbers refreshed. The balance of my primary liquid account stood at exactly $84,200,000. The $20,000 bribe from my daughter dropped into the ocean of my wealth like a single grain of sand. Morgan believed she purchased my eternal absence completely forever. She had no idea she had handed pocket change to a man who owned the very debt on the building she lived in. I dismissed Sterling. He bowed again and left the room, securing the heavy steel door firmly behind him. Alone in the silent vault, I stared at the digital receipt. The numbers blurred as my mind drifted back 5 years. I remembered the cold, sterile smell of the hospital room where my beloved wife Evelyn spent her final days. Evelyn was the brilliant mind behind our early real estate investments. We built an empire in the absolute shadows. We never flaunted our success. We lived quietly, funneling our wealth into secure trusts and aggressive market expansions. But as Evelyn's illness progressed, her concerns shifted entirely to Morgan. She saw the creeping entitlement in our daughter. She witnessed the ruthless ambition that eclipsed any sense of family loyalty. On her deathbed, Evelyn gripped my hand with surprising strength. She made me swear a solemn oath. She begged me to keep our empire completely hidden from Morgan. She insisted we needed to test our daughter's true character, to see if she would love a humble mechanic father unconditionally, completely, forever. I kept that promise flawlessly. I endured Morgan's condescension. I tolerated her mocking remarks about my rundown apartment. I let her believe I was a failure because I desperately wanted her to prove her mother wrong. Today the test concluded. Morgan had failed spectacularly. She had proven her soul was entirely bankrupt. She chose vanity over blood. She chose optics over love. The grief of losing my daughter to her own greed was a heavy burden, but the clarity it provided was absolute. I wiped a single tear from my eye and locked away my sorrow for good absolutely now. The electronic lock on the vault door clicked. Mitchell, my lead corporate attorney, stepped into the room. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and wore a grim expression. Mitchell was the only person alive who knew the full extent of my financial holdings. I had summoned him the moment Morgan left my apartment. I demanded a comprehensive background check on Ethan, the wealthy tech executive Morgan was preparing to marry. Mitchell placed a thick, sealed dossier on the table. He took a seat across from me and unclasped the file. He stated his investigative team worked all night long continually. He confirmed that Ethan was a genuinely decent man. Ethan had built his software company from nothing, driven by hard work and authentic innovation. He had no criminal record, no hidden liabilities, and a spotless reputation in the tech industry. Ethan was entirely innocent. I felt a brief moment of relief, thinking my daughter had at least chosen a good partner. That relief shattered instantly. Mitchell slid a secondary folder across the table. He told me to look closely at the financial routing numbers. He revealed a dark, irrefutable truth. Morgan was not simply marrying Ethan for his high status. She was actively destroying him from the inside. Mitchell uncovered a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. Over the past 6 months, Morgan had been secretly siphoning massive amounts of capital from Ethan's startup funds. She was manipulating the company ledger and transferring the stolen money directly into an untraceable offshore account registered under a shell corporation. My daughter was an active financial predator. She was preparing to ruin an innocent man the moment they signed the marriage certificate. I realized I had to stop her. But before I could act, a heavy knock sounded on my apartment door later that dark evening. The sudden violent pounding against my front door shattered the absolute silence of my rundown apartment. I froze silently in the dim light of the narrow hallway, my boots making no sound against the cracked linoleum. Nobody ever visited me at this late hour, and Morgan had already secured my guaranteed absence for her wedding tomorrow. My mind raced back to the profound revelation I had experienced just hours earlier inside the private vault of the bank. Mitchell, my corporate attorney, had exposed my daughter as a methodical financial predator. The damning spreadsheets he provided detailed a labyrinth of illicit wire transfers. Morgan had systematically bypassed the security protocols of her fiancé's startup company. She was actively draining Ethan's operational capital and moving massive sums into untraceable offshore shell companies. I felt a cold, heavy knot tighten deep within my chest as the magnitude of her deception became clear. The pain of her earlier insult regarding my grease-stained mechanic uniform faded, replaced by a fierce sense of moral responsibility. Ethan was a brilliant, hardworking tech executive who had dedicated his entire life to building that software company. He was entirely innocent in this situation. He believed he was marrying the woman of his dreams, completely unaware that she was actively dismantling his empire from the inside. I thought about my late wife, Evelyn. We had worked tirelessly alongside each other to build our fortune with absolute integrity. We had spent decades navigating the ruthless corporate world of Chicago, securing our legacy so our daughter would never know the sting of poverty. We had given Morgan every advantage, every top-tier education, every opportunity to succeed honestly. Instead, she had weaponized that privilege to execute a flawless corporate theft. I could not allow this wedding to proceed as a genuine union. If Morgan successfully married Ethan without intervention, she would legally entangle her stolen assets with his legitimate wealth. She would bleed his company dry and leave him utterly ruined. I absolutely had to stop her immediately. However, I faced a critical tactical dilemma. If I revealed my true identity as a billionaire mogul prematurely, Morgan would instantly realize her offshore accounts were compromised. She would panic, transfer the stolen funds deeper into the dark web, and likely flee the country before we could recover Ethan's capital. I needed to paralyze her financial network completely, but I had to remain entirely invisible until the trap snapped shut. The mechanic from the south side of Chicago had to remain her primary focus. She needed to believe she had successfully bought my absence and secured her flawless elite aesthetic. Before leaving the vault earlier, I had turned my gaze away from the spreadsheets and looked directly at my attorney. Mitchell met my eyes, fully understanding the gravity of the situation. I did not ask for his legal advice. I issued a series of absolute, uncompromising directives. I ordered him to draft a comprehensive suite of emergency legal injunctions. We were going to establish an ironclad financial blockade around every single offshore account Morgan had created. Mitchell pulled out his encrypted tablet and began typing rapidly as I dictated the parameters of the strike. I wanted the freeze orders locked and loaded with federal banking authorities ready to be executed at a moment's notice. But timing was the most critical element of this operation. I explicitly instructed Mitchell not to file the injunctions today. We would hold the legal strike until tomorrow afternoon. I wanted the trap to spring at the exact moment Morgan signed the official marriage certificate. She needed to stand at the altar surrounded by her wealthy guests, believing she had achieved absolute victory. I wanted her to feel the intoxicating rush of complete success. I wanted her to think she had outsmarted Ethan, erased her working-class father, and secured a stolen fortune. Then the second the ink dried on that legal document, Mitchell was to execute the freeze. The bank would lock her shell companies, block her credit lines, and sever her access to every stolen dollar. She would fall from the pinnacle of high society into absolute financial ruin in a matter of seconds. Mitchell nodded sharply, confirming he understood the precise choreography of the ambush. He assured me the documents would be airtight, leaving her with absolutely no legal maneuvering room. I instructed him to coordinate silently with Ethan's corporate board to ensure the startup capital could be seamlessly repatriated once the authorities seized Morgan's accounts. I refused to let an innocent man pay the price for my daughter's boundless greed. I thanked Mitchell for his swift action, gathered the physical copies of the financial reports, and placed them into my jacket pocket. The strategy was set in stone. I exited the bank through the private garage, slipping away from the affluent downtown district completely unseen. I had returned to my apartment to pack a heavy black duffel bag with faded flannel shirts, preparing to relocate to a secure hotel to monitor the strike. Then the unexpected knocking began. The sheer force of the hammering rattled the cheap wooden frame of my front door, pulling me forcefully back to the present moment. The sky outside my single-bedroom window had darkened as a heavy, relentless storm rolled across the city. The cold wind howled into the poorly lit hallway, bringing a sharp draft that seeped through the cracks in the walls. I grabbed the handle of my duffel bag, my mind completely focused on the precise execution of the upcoming ruthless financial blockade. I walked very slowly through the extremely dark living room, maintaining my blue-collar disguise just in case I encountered anyone highly suspicious. I reached the heavy door and unfastened the rusted metal deadbolt with a loud click. I pulled the handle back, bracing myself against the sudden rush of freezing rain that swept into the apartment. A man stood on the wet concrete landing, shivering violently and uncontrollably. It was Ethan, the entirely innocent groom. The wealthy white tech executive, the man my daughter planned to ruin tomorrow, stood completely soaked in the freezing downpour. His expensive tailored suit was ruined, plastered to his shaking frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead, dripping water onto his expensive leather shoes. He looked up at me, his face pale and contorted with absolute devastation. Tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing freely with the relentless Chicago rain. He did not look like a triumphant groom eagerly anticipating his wedding day. Instead, he looked like a terrified man whose entire world had just been violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right before his very eyes. The man who was supposed to marry my daughter tomorrow morning had sought out the father she had vehemently disowned. He stood on my doorstep, a broken shell of a CEO, desperately seeking answers that only I could provide. The elaborate trap I had constructed alongside Mitchell suddenly felt inadequate for the emotional collateral damage unfolding in front of me. I stared at him, realizing that the timeline of my retaliation had just accelerated dramatically. The storm outside raged on, but the true hurricane had just walked directly into my living room. The cold Chicago rain blew sideways through the open doorway, soaking the shoulders of my flannel shirt. Ethan stood frozen on the concrete landing. He was a man accustomed to corner offices and private jets, yet he looked completely shattered. Water dripped from his soaked hair down his pale face. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His gaze moved from my face to the grease stains on my jeans, then back to my eyes. A sudden profound shock washed over his features. The confusion melted away into absolute disbelief. He took a slow, trembling step over the threshold. He ignored the peeling paint and the dirty linoleum floor entirely. His legs gave out beneath him. The wealthy tech executive dropped heavily to his knees right in the middle of my cramped entryway. He bowed his head and heavy, racking sobs tore through his chest. He looked up at me, his eyes entirely red and desperate. He spoke a single trembling name. He called me Mr. J. Hearing that alias in my rundown apartment felt like a collision of two entirely different universes. I reached out, grabbed him by the shoulder of his ruined suit, and pulled him fully inside. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut against the howling storm, sealing us inside the quiet, dim space. I guided him toward the worn armchair in the corner of the room. Ethan sank heavily into the faded fabric. He covered his pale face with his wet hands, desperately trying to compose himself. I stood over him, my mind racing. Morgan had meticulously crafted a narrative of abuse and poverty, yet the man she planned to marry had just recognized me as the titan of his industry. I crossed the room and poured him a glass of water. I handed it to him, demanding to know exactly how he recognized me. Ethan took the glass with shaking fingers. He took a ragged breath and began to speak. His voice was hoarse, filled with a mixture of immense gratitude and absolute horror. He told me he would never forget my voice or the shape of my silhouette. 5 years ago, Ethan was a desperate young developer. He had poured every ounce of his energy into building his software company. He was brilliant, but he lacked the capital to survive the aggressive market. He recounted the darkest week of his entire life. His startup was exactly 2 days away from complete bankruptcy. The traditional banks had rejected his business loans. The major venture capital firms had offered predatory equity deals that would have completely stripped him of his own creation. He had been standing on the very edge of ruin, ready to lose everything he had ever worked for. Then, an anonymous angel investor intervened. Ethan described the single meeting we shared. He remembered being summoned to a sprawling, dimly lit office building long after midnight. He remembered sitting across a massive oak desk from an African-American man whose face remained obscured by the deep shadows of the room. He remembered the calm, authoritative voice that offered him a vital lifeline. I had provided the exact funding he needed to launch his software globally. I had demanded fair terms, refusing to steal his company from him. I gave him the capital, the resources, and the respect he deserved. I had saved his professional life. Ethan looked at the peeling wallpaper of my apartment. He stated he had spent 5 grueling years trying to uncover the true identity of his anonymous savior. He wanted to thank the man who believed in him when the entire corporate world had turned its back. He stared at my calloused hands. He said he recognized my voice the very moment I spoke to him at the front door. The deep cadence, the steady authority, the absolute calm. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the retired mechanic standing before him was the billionaire who built his empire. I confirmed his realization. I told him I was indeed the man who funded his company. I then asked him the most critical question. I demanded to know why he was standing in my apartment on the eve of his wedding. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Fresh tears mixed with the rainwater on his face. The reality of his situation was physically tearing him apart. He explained his honest intention behind the sudden visit. Morgan had spun a tragic, elaborate web of lies regarding her family. She had told Ethan that her father was a violent, deadbeat mechanic who had abandoned her and her late mother. She claimed I was a worthless addict living in squalor, completely disconnected from her daily life. She painted herself as a triumphant survivor who had overcome immense trauma to reach high society. Ethan, driven by a genuine, compassionate heart, had wanted to heal that deep emotional wound. He believed no bride should walk down the aisle without her father. He had secretly hired a premium private investigator exactly 2 weeks ago. He paid an exorbitant fee to track down Morgan's estranged, abusive father. He wanted to orchestrate a beautiful surprise reconciliation right before the wedding ceremony. He wanted to bring a broken family back together. The investigator had delivered my address just hours ago. Ethan had driven through the severe storm expecting to confront a miserable broken man. Instead, the private investigator's trail led the successful tech CEO directly to the doorstep of his ultimate benefactor. The profound irony of the situation struck him with the brutal force of a freight train. He realized his beautiful, sophisticated fiancée had completely fabricated her entire tragic past. The worthless mechanic she despised was actually the invisible billionaire who owned her fiancé's incredible success. Ethan gripped the arms of the chair tightly. His breathing became erratic as the entire foundation of his romantic relationship completely crumbled. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying new understanding. He realized Morgan was not a vulnerable survivor. She was a calculating, pathological liar. She had manipulated his deepest sympathies to secure her prominent position by his side. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. Ethan stared blankly at the stained wall, his mind frantically processing the immense scale of the deception. He had granted her unrestricted access to his corporate accounts because she claimed she had never known financial security. Every single tear she had ever shed about her traumatic upbringing had been a meticulously performed theatrical act. She had preyed upon his inherent goodness, weaponizing his empathy to extract wealth without any genuine affection. The horrifying truth settled over him like a suffocating shroud. He was preparing to legally bind himself to a ruthless opportunist who viewed his existence as a highly lucrative acquisition. Ethan buried his face in his hands, once again the devastating weight of betrayal crushing his spirit. He realized the beautiful woman waiting at the luxury estate was an absolute stranger. He had fallen in love with a phantom, an illusion designed specifically to secure his fortune. The grand wedding tomorrow was not a celebration of true love. It was merely the final stage of a hostile corporate takeover. Ethan collapsed backward against the worn cushions of the armchair. The freezing rain from his ruined suit pooled on the faded fabric, but he did not notice the uncomfortable dampness. He stared blindly at the peeling wallpaper of my living room as the absolute magnitude of the deception completely shattered his reality. He muttered Morgan's name repeatedly, his voice cracking under the heavy weight of an agonizing betrayal. He began to recount the elaborate narrative she had woven around his vulnerable heart. Morgan had painted a breathtaking masterpiece of relentless suffering. She told him her father was a violent, destitute alcoholic who terrorized her youth daily. She described fleeing this very apartment in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back to escape my supposed physical abuse. She claimed she had fought tooth and nail to survive a childhood defined solely by relentless poverty and emotional cruelty. Ethan had believed every single word without a shadow of a doubt. His innate compassion had completely blinded him to the glaring discrepancies in her story. He had offered her his heart, his luxurious home, and unrestricted access to his corporate accounts to heal the deep trauma she had so flawlessly pantomimed. The horrific realization struck him like a physical blow to the stomach. He clutched his chest, gasping for air in the dim light. The beautiful, vulnerable woman he intended to marry tomorrow morning was an absolute phantom. She was a meticulously constructed illusion, designed specifically to infiltrate his life, manipulate his emotions, and extract his immense wealth. He had willingly handed his entire technology empire over to a ruthless financial predator. He looked away from the stained wall and locked his bloodshot eyes directly on me. His incredulous gaze swept over the cracked linoleum floor, the outdated kitchen appliances, and the exposed plumbing pipes above the rusted sink. He demanded to know why the man who had single-handedly rescued his tech company lived in such appalling squalor. He knew the massive scale of my private investments. He knew I commanded hundreds of millions of dollars across multiple global industries. He asked why an extraordinarily successful billionaire would purposefully choose to exist in a rotting tenement building on the south side of Chicago while his only daughter paraded through high society in designer gowns. He could not comprehend the severe dichotomy between my immense hidden power and my dilapidated physical surroundings. His confusion was entirely justified. The visual contradiction was jarring, intentionally designed to repel anyone who valued superficial status over genuine human connection. I did not offer him a verbal explanation right away. I stood up, walked over to the scratched wooden table, and picked up the thick manila envelope Morgan had delivered just a few hours earlier. I walked back and dropped the heavy package directly onto Ethan's lap. The flap opened, revealing the thick, organized stacks of crisp, untraceable $100 bills. I told Ethan that his beloved fiancé had visited me this afternoon. I explained that she had brought exactly $20,000 in cash to purchase my permanent absence from the upcoming wedding ceremony. She considered my blue-collar appearance a terminal threat to her newly established elite aesthetic. Ethan stared at the illicit cash with pure, unadulterated revulsion. I sat down on the small wooden chair opposite him and finally explained the true origins of this miserable apartment. 5 years ago, my brilliant and beloved wife Evelyn lay dying in a sterile hospital room. Evelyn and I had built our massive venture capital fortune together in absolute secrecy. We wanted our daughter to value hard work, integrity, and genuine human connection above all else. But Evelyn saw the darkness taking deep root in Morgan. She saw the creeping entitlement and the ruthless, corrosive ambition that rapidly eclipsed any sense of familial loyalty. On her deathbed, Evelyn made me swear a solemn, unbreakable oath. She begged me to conceal the entirety of our empire from Morgan indefinitely. She insisted we needed a definitive test to reveal our daughter's true character to the world. I purchased this derelict apartment the exact week after Evelyn passed away. I donned faded flannel shirts and completely immersed myself in the role of a broken, retired mechanic. I voluntarily subjected myself to Morgan's endless condescension and vicious verbal abuse. I allowed her to treat me like a disease because I desperately needed her to prove her dying mother wrong. Today, the test reached its brutal conclusion. Morgan failed without a singular ounce of hesitation. Ethan listened to my explanation in stunned silence. The two of us sat across from each other in the dim light of the failing storm. We were two vastly different men from entirely different worlds. He was a wealthy white tech executive in the absolute prime of his life. I was an undercover black billionaire posing as a blue-collar mechanic in my twilight years. Yet in that exact moment, an unbreakable alliance forged itself rapidly between us. We were permanently united by the shared agonizing trauma of loving an absolute monster. Ethan wiped the cold rain and frustrated tears from his face. His profound sorrow evaporated instantly, replaced by a sudden violent anger. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket and pulled out his sleek smartphone. He declared that he was calling his executive security team immediately. He stated he would cancel the lavish wedding, freeze the corporate accounts, and banish Morgan from his luxury penthouse tonight. He was ready to cut his immense financial losses and sever the toxic connection entirely. I leaned forward and clamped my hand firmly over his wrist. I stopped his fingers from dialing the number. I looked deeply into his furious eyes and slowly shook my head. I told him that a private cancellation was entirely unacceptable. A quiet dismissal behind closed doors would simply allow a skilled predator like Morgan to spin the narrative, play the ultimate victim, and quietly hunt for her next wealthy target. She had blatantly stolen his startup capital, profoundly defiled her mother's memory, and literally sold her own father for pocket change. I stated that she did not deserve the unearned mercy of a silent, dignified exit. I released his wrist and leaned back in my chair. I told Ethan that the grand wedding ceremony must proceed exactly as she had meticulously planned it. We were absolutely not going to cancel her glorious moment of ultimate triumph. We were going to patiently orchestrate the absolute, uncompromising public execution of her entire social standing. I explained that she needed to stand proudly at the beautiful altar, surrounded by all her wealthy elite peers, fully believing she had completely won the ultimate prize. She needed to feel the intoxicating rush of absolute victory coursing through her veins. Ethan slowly lowered his phone and nodded in silent agreement. The fierce determination returning to his eyes mirrored my own unspoken resolve. We would allow her to smile brightly for the cameras today. We would watch her arrogantly celebrate tonight, fully aware that her total social annihilation awaited her tomorrow. We would completely destroy her carefully fabricated reality without a single shred of hesitation or regret, because she had decisively chosen this very destructive path entirely for herself. Ethan stared at me as the magnitude of my proposal settled into his mind. I had just told him that we were not going to cancel the wedding. I demanded that we let Morgan put on her pristine white dress and walk down the aisle in front of hundreds of elite guests. I wanted her to stand at the altar and look out at the crowd with absolute certainty that her malicious deception had succeeded. Ethan's initial reaction was a fierce rejection. He argued that allowing the ceremony to begin would validate her lies and subject him to unbearable public humiliation. He stated he could not stand next to a woman who viewed him as a financial target. I leaned across the small wooden table and locked my eyes onto his. I told him that true justice requires immense discipline. If he canceled the wedding tonight over a private phone call, Morgan would instantly pivot her strategy. She would play the heartbroken victim for the media. She would claim this wealthy tech executive abandoned her at the last minute because of her humble upbringing. She would easily manipulate the narrative and escape with the millions she had already funneled into her offshore accounts. I explained that we needed to sever her social and financial lifelines simultaneously in a highly public arena. We needed every single venture capitalist, politician, and socialite in that ballroom to witness her complete unmasking. The absolute destruction of her reputation was the only way to ensure she could never prey on another innocent person again. We had to orchestrate a spectacle that would permanently banish her from the elite circles she so desperately coveted. She had to face the consequences of her greed. Ethan looked into my eyes, processing the sheer magnitude of the impending devastation. Ethan absorbed my words slowly. The furious tension in his shoulders began to loosen, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. The devastated groom vanished, and the brilliant CEO who had built a technology empire from the ground up returned. He nodded his head in silent agreement. He recognized the brutal logic of my strategy. We mapped out the precise choreography of the following day. Ethan would return to his luxury penthouse tonight and behave exactly as a nervous, excited groom should. He would send her a loving text message before he went to sleep. He would arrive at the estate tomorrow morning with a warm smile and greet her bridesmaids with perfect charm. He had to suppress every ounce of his burning disgust and play his part flawlessly. He had to hand her the ultimate victory before we ripped it away. Ethan wiped the remaining moisture from his face with the back of his hand. He stood up from the worn armchair. He adjusted the lapels of his ruined suit jacket. He looked around my cramped, grease-stained apartment one last time, fully comprehending the massive power hidden beneath its decaying surface. He thanked me for saving his life for a second time. I told him to go home and prepare for war. He walked out of my living room and stepped back into the freezing Chicago rain. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him. I stood alone in the absolute silence of my apartment. The storm battered the single-bedroom window, but my mind was entirely focused on the final phase of the ambush. I pulled my secure smartphone from my pocket and scrolled through my encrypted contact list. I found the private number for Arthur Sterling. Arthur was the general manager of the Grand Plaza estate. The Grand Plaza was a sprawling, ultra-luxury property located on the affluent North Shore. It was the most exclusive wedding venue in the state, boasting manicured botanical gardens and a breathtaking crystal ballroom. Morgan had spent months boasting about securing a reservation at this highly coveted location. She believed hosting her wedding at the Grand Plaza proved her undeniable ascension into the absolute highest tier of society. She did not know a vital piece of corporate trivia. My primary holding company had quietly purchased the Grand Plaza estate 3 years ago. I owned the sprawling grounds, the crystal ballroom, and every single blade of grass on the property. I pressed the call button. The line rang exactly twice before Arthur answered. His voice was crisp, professional, and slightly guarded. He asked who was calling his private line at such a late hour. I did not introduce myself by my given name. I used the specific corporate access code designated for the primary shareholder. Arthur gasped audibly. His professional tone instantly morphed into one of deep, breathless reverence. He addressed me as Mr. Chairman. He apologized profusely for not recognizing the incoming number. He stated he had never received a direct phone call from the owner of the estate in all his years of service. He asked how he could personally assist me tonight. I ignored his nervous apologies and delivered my instructions with absolute clarity. I informed him that I would be attending a private event at his venue tomorrow morning. I specified the exact wedding ceremony I would be observing. Arthur frantically pulled up the event registry on his computer. He confirmed the reservation under my daughter's name. I ordered him to grant me unrestricted access to the entire property. I demanded total clearance to the private service corridors, the security control room, and the main ballroom. I explicitly instructed him to inform his head of security that a highly classified VIP would arrive unannounced. I told Arthur that my presence must remain an absolute secret from the bride, the groom, and the entire event planning staff until the exact moment I stepped onto the main floor. Arthur assured me my directives would be executed flawlessly. He promised my privacy would be protected with the highest level of security. I terminated the call and placed the phone on the scratched kitchen table. I walked into my small bedroom and opened the heavy cedar closet. The harsh fluorescent light illuminated the row of stained mechanic uniforms I wore to maintain my daily disguise. I reached past the grease-covered denim and unzipped a thick garment bag hanging in the very back. I pulled out a bespoke Italian tuxedo crafted from midnight blue velvet. I ran my calloused fingers over the pristine fabric. I had not worn this suit since Evelyn passed away. I pulled a polished mahogany box from the top shelf and opened the lid. A solid gold watch rested on the velvet cushion, gleaming in the dim light. I lifted the heavy timepiece and secured it around my wrist. The cold metal felt like a familiar armor. I packed a small leather travel bag and walked back toward the front door. The tired, disrespected mechanic who allowed his daughter to hurl insults at him was completely dead. The ruthless billionaire titan was fully awake. I stepped out of the rundown apartment and locked the deadbolt. Morgan was preparing to celebrate the greatest triumph of her life inside a fortress that belonged entirely to me. She was walking blindly into a steel trap, and I held the only key. The morning of the wedding arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the bridal suite at the Grand Plaza estate. Morgan stood in the direct center of the lavish room like a conquering monarch. She wore a pristine silk robe and held a crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. She barked sharp, cruel commands at the frightened hotel staff scurrying around her. She demanded they adjust the ambient lighting immediately. She ordered a young woman to completely remake the intricate floral arrangements because the white roses looked too cheap. She treated the dedicated workers with absolute contempt. She dismissed a terrified seamstress, adjusting the hem of her gown, snapping loudly that the girl lacked basic human competence. Her 4 bridesmaids sat on plush velvet sofas, sipping their own expensive drinks and laughing softly at her vicious remarks. Morgan turned to her friends and raised her glass in a highly triumphant toast. She boasted proudly about her ultimate victory over her embarrassing past. She told them she had successfully eliminated the final obstacle to her perfect high society life. She laughed loudly as she described the pathetic encounter with her father the previous afternoon. She recounted sliding a thick envelope of $20,000 across a severely scratched wooden table to a tired, broken man. She mocked the faded flannel shirt he wore. She told her bridesmaids that the old pathetic mechanic actually took the heavy bribe without saying a single word of protest. She felt entirely invincible in this beautiful suite. She believed she had permanently severed the humiliating tie to a man whose hands always smelled of cheap motor oil. She told her friends that she was destined for absolute greatness and that poverty was simply a disease she had successfully cured. She then spun a completely fabricated tale about her father demanding the cash. She painted herself as the generous, heartbroken victim who graciously paid off a violent addict just to secure temporary peace on her special day. Her friends cooed with manufactured sympathy, praising her stunning resilience and her breathtaking beauty. Morgan drank the last drop of her champagne and demanded another full glass immediately. She looked at her reflection in the gilded mirror and saw a flawless, elite queen completely untouchable by reality. She remembered how she despised the grease stains on his hands when she was a child. She remembered feeling immense shame whenever he dropped her off at her private high school in his battered truck. Jameson had worked grueling double shifts to ensure she never lacked academic opportunities. He had sacrificed his own physical health to elevate her status. Morgan viewed those sacrifices not as profound paternal love, but as a disgusting reminder of her blue-collar origins. She had spent her entire adult life meticulously erasing every single trace of his existence from her public persona. She crafted a sophisticated, tragic narrative of being an orphaned survivor who climbed the social ladder through sheer brilliance. The $20,000 was the final payment to ensure her carefully constructed illusion remained totally intact. She smiled at her reflection, completely convinced that her deception was absolutely bulletproof. She was about to marry a wealthy technology executive and secure millions of dollars in untraceable offshore accounts. She believed she had outsmarted everyone in her life. A soft knock at the heavy oak door interrupted her arrogant celebration. Ethan stepped into the bridal suite carrying a dark velvet jewelry box. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. His hair was impeccably styled. He looked exactly like the wealthy technology CEO Morgan believed she had successfully conquered. He smiled warmly at the bridesmaids and politely asked for a brief moment alone with his beautiful bride. The women giggled and quickly exited the room, leaving the couple completely alone. Morgan walked toward Ethan with a radiant, predatory smile. She reached out to embrace him. Ethan stepped forward and met her embrace flawlessly. He wrapped his arms around her delicate frame. His heart pounded with absolute disgust, but his face remained a flawless mask of pure adoration. He played the role of the blissfully ignorant groom to absolute perfection. He vividly remembered the agonizing truth he had learned in Jameson's rundown apartment just hours earlier. He knew this woman was actively draining his startup capital into an untraceable offshore shell company. He knew her entire tragic backstory was a meticulously crafted lie designed exclusively to exploit his empathy. He violently suppressed the burning urge to confront her immediately. He maintained the intense discipline he and Jameson had agreed upon the night before. He pulled back from the embrace and looked deeply into her eyes. He told her she looked absolutely breathtaking. Morgan beamed, completely blind to the cold calculation operating directly behind his warm gaze. Ethan opened the velvet box he held in his hands. A magnificent diamond necklace rested against the dark fabric. The heavy stones caught the morning light and scattered brilliant reflections across the sweet walls. Morgan gasped in genuine delight. She turned around and lifted her hair eagerly, inviting him to fasten the expensive jewelry around her neck. Ethan stepped behind her. His hands remained entirely steady as he secured the complicated gold clasp. He stared at her reflection in the heavy vanity mirror. He told her softly that she deserved exactly what was coming to her today. Morgan smiled brightly, interpreting his words as a profound declaration of endless love and financial devotion. She turned around and kissed him, utterly unaware that the diamond necklace was not a wedding gift. It was the final marker before her complete social execution. Ethan stepped back, excused himself to check on the groomsmen, and walked out the door. He left Morgan alone to admire her stolen glory. Across town, the severe storm from the previous night had completely passed. Jameson stood in the absolute silence of his rundown apartment. He walked into his small, cramped bedroom and unlocked the heavy cedar closet. He reached past the row of stained mechanic uniforms. He pushed the faded flannel shirts aside. He unzipped a thick garment bag hanging in the very back. He pulled out a bespoke Italian tuxedo crafted from midnight blue fabric. He dressed with slow, methodical precision. He fastened the crisp white collar and adjusted his black silk bow tie. He pulled a polished mahogany box from the top shelf and opened the lid. A solid gold watch rested on a velvet cushion. He lifted the heavy timepiece and secured it tightly around his wrist. The cold metal felt like familiar armor. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror on the door. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the immense power he had kept hidden for 5 long years. He reached into his pocket and felt the $20,000 Morgan had given him. He intended to deliver her change personally. The tired, disrespected mechanic who allowed his arrogant daughter to hurl vicious insults at him was completely dead. The ruthless billionaire titan was fully awake and ready for war. He grabbed his heavy steel keys and confidently walked out of the quiet apartment to meticulously orchestrate her absolute ruin today. The crystal ballroom of the Grand Plaza estate stood as a breathtaking monument to unfettered wealth and elite privilege. Hundreds of the most influential figures in Chicago high society filled the cavernous space, their hushed conversations creating a steady, sophisticated hum beneath the vaulted, gold-leafed ceilings. Massive chandeliers crafted from thousands of imported crystal tears cast a warm, golden glow over the immaculate arrangements of rare white orchids and imported lilies. Waitstaff in pristine white coats glided silently between the rows of gilded chairs, offering flutes of vintage champagne to the waiting dignitaries, venture capitalists, and political elites. Every single detail of the room had been meticulously curated to project an image of absolute perfection. Morgan had spent months obsessing over this precise aesthetic, determined to prove her undeniable ascension into the highest echelon of the city's social hierarchy. She wanted her wedding to be remembered as the crowning achievement of the season, a flawless spectacle that would permanently cement her status among the wealthy elite. The guests sat in quiet anticipation, completely unaware of the brutal financial crossfire that had been secretly orchestrated behind closed doors. They admired the cascading floral arches and the sheer opulence of the venue, assuming they were about to witness a beautiful union between a brilliant technology executive and his stunning, sophisticated bride. They believed they were attending a celebration of profound love and mutual success. The string quartet positioned near the altar began to play a delicate classical melody, signaling the imminent arrival of the bridal party. A hush fell over the massive room. Ethan stood at the front of the aisle, positioned perfectly beneath a towering canopy of white roses. He wore his bespoke black tuxedo with flawless elegance. His posture was entirely rigid, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. To the hundreds of guests observing him, he looked like a nervous, eager groom, completely captivated by the gravity of the moment. In reality, he was a man standing on the very edge of a precipice, bracing himself for an unprecedented social detonation. He looked out at the sea of affluent faces, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He knew that the beautiful illusion was about to be violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom slowly opened, and the orchestral music suddenly swelled into a triumphant, majestic crescendo. Morgan stepped into the grand aisle, and a collective gasp of admiration rippled through the seated crowd. She looked absolutely magnificent. She wore a custom-designed silk gown that trailed elegantly across the polished marble floor. The heavy diamond necklace Ethan had fastened around her neck just an hour ago rested perfectly against her collarbone, catching the light from the chandeliers and throwing brilliant, blinding flashes across the room. Her hair was styled in an immaculate, sweeping cascade, and her makeup highlighted her sharp, predatory beauty. She held a massive bouquet of white peonies, her knuckles white with the tight grip of absolute victory. Morgan walked down the long, flower-lined aisle with the slow, deliberate pacing of a conquering monarch claiming her newly won kingdom. She looked at the faces of the wealthy guests turning to admire her, and a surge of intoxicating power flooded her veins. She beamed with radiant triumph, completely convinced that she had successfully outsmarted everyone in her life. She believed she had permanently erased the humiliating memory of her blue-collar father. She believed she had flawlessly secured a stolen fortune that would sustain her luxurious lifestyle indefinitely. Every step she took toward the altar felt like a definitive step away from the grease-stained tenement apartment on the south side of the city. She felt entirely invincible, wrapped in a protective armor of stolen wealth and fabricated prestige. Ethan watched her glide toward him, his internal disgust burning hotter with every passing second. He maintained his warm, adoring smile with a monumental effort of sheer willpower. He saw the genuine pride shining in her eyes and felt sick to his stomach. He was looking directly at a master manipulator, a woman who had weaponized his deepest sympathies and drained his corporate accounts without a single ounce of remorse. She reached the end of the aisle and stepped up to the elevated altar, handing her bouquet to her maid of honor. She turned to face Ethan, taking both of his hands in hers. Her skin was warm, her smile radiant and utterly deceitful. She whispered that she loved him, her voice dripping with manufactured devotion. Ethan squeezed her hands gently, refusing to break his character prematurely. He knew the trap had to spring at the exact right moment to ensure maximum devastation. The elderly officiant stepped forward to the polished wooden podium, adjusting his reading glasses as he looked out over the massive crowd. He raised his hands, gesturing for the hundreds of elite guests to take their seats. The rustling of expensive fabric and the soft murmur of the attendees slowly faded into absolute silence. The officiant began to speak, his deep, resonant voice echoing clearly across the cavernous ballroom. He spoke eloquently about the profound virtues of honesty, mutual trust, and the unbreakable foundation of a genuine partnership. Every word he uttered felt like a sharp, agonizing needle twisting directly into Ethan's chest. Morgan maintained her flawless, glowing expression, nodding gently at the officiant's words, as if she genuinely comprehended the concept of integrity. She squeezed Ethan's hands affectionately, completely blind to the furious storm raging just beneath his calm exterior. The officiant smoothly transitioned to the traditional, legal requirements of the ceremony. He looked at the couple, then shifted his gaze toward the silent, captivated audience. He asked the mandatory, age-old question. He demanded to know if anyone present possessed a valid, lawful reason why this man and this woman should not be joined in holy matrimony. He instructed them to speak now or forever hold their peace. The officiant paused, expecting the standard respectful silence that always followed this procedural formality. Morgan smiled brighter, already anticipating the exchange of the heavy gold rings. She was mere seconds away from legally entangling her stolen assets with his legitimate technology empire. Ethan did not wait for the silence to settle. He suddenly released Morgan's hands, the unexpected movement jarring and abrupt. He took a deliberate, forceful step backward, physically distancing himself from her pristine white gown. Morgan's radiant smile faltered instantly. Confusion flickered across her perfectly contoured face. She reached out toward him, whispering his name in a panicked, questioning tone. Ethan completely ignored her outstretched hand. He turned away from his beautiful bride and walked directly toward the polished wooden podium. He reached out and smoothly took the microphone from the startled officiant's trembling fingers. A heavy, suffocating tension instantly gripped the entire ballroom. The hundreds of wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their gilded chairs, their eyes darting between the isolated bride and the grim, determined groom. Ethan turned to face the massive crowd. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles turning white. He looked out at the sea of venture capitalists, corporate board members, and elite socialites. He did not yell. He did not lose his composure. He spoke with a cold, devastating clarity that amplified through the premium sound system and bounced off the crystal chandeliers. He stated with absolute, unwavering conviction that he could not marry a thief. The words dropped into the cavernous ballroom like a live grenade. Total, paralyzing silence reigned for one terrifying fraction of a second before the entire room erupted into absolute pandemonium. Morgan's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. The flawless illusion of her perfect life shattered instantly, the jagged pieces raining down around her. The blood rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking completely ghost-like beneath the harsh ballroom lights. She lunged forward, her pristine silk gown tangling around her legs. She grabbed Ethan's arm frantically, her manicured nails digging deeply into the fabric of his tuxedo jacket. She screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and entirely hysterical. She desperately yelled to the shocked audience that Ethan was suffering from a severe nervous breakdown. She claimed the immense pressure of his technology startup had completely fractured his mental stability. She frantically ordered the bridesmaids to call for a doctor and demanded the officiant ignore his insane, delusional accusations. The wealthy guests erupted into chaotic, overlapping conversations. Venture capitalists pulled out their smartphones, rapidly texting their corporate boards about the sudden, disastrous collapse of the prominent CEO. Women in designer dresses gasped and clutched their pearls, completely scandalized by the brutal, public confrontation unfolding at the altar. Morgan continued to scream, her carefully constructed elite aesthetic dissolving into raw, frantic desperation. She realized her offshore shell companies, her stolen fortune, and her high society status were rapidly vaporizing right in front of her eyes. She turned toward the estate staff, violently demanding they remove Ethan from the stage immediately. The uniformed security personnel stationed at the edges of the ballroom began to move quickly toward the altar, their radios buzzing with urgent, confused commands. The elegant, sophisticated wedding had instantly devolved into a spectacular, humiliating disaster. Ethan stood his ground entirely unmoving, watching her desperately try to salvage her ruined facade. He felt an immense, overwhelming wave of vindication wash over him. The public execution had commenced exactly as planned. Before the security team could reach the podium to intervene in the escalating madness, a sudden, violent noise drowned out the chaotic screaming of the crowd. The massive solid oak doors at the very back of the crystal ballroom swung open with a deafening, thunderous crash. The heavy wood slammed brutally against the marble walls, echoing like a cannon shot over the panicked audience. The entire room froze instantly. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously toward the grand entrance, completely paralyzed by the sudden dramatic interruption. The deafening echo of the massive oak doors slamming against the polished marble walls hung suspended over the paralyzed crowd. Every single guest in the crystal ballroom turned to face the grand entrance. I stood perfectly still on the threshold, letting the harsh, brilliant light from the cascading chandeliers wash over my bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. The tired, defeated mechanic from the south side of Chicago had been completely eradicated. In his place stood a man who commanded global industries, projecting an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority. The sheer power radiating from my posture instantly suffocated the chaotic murmurs of the elite attendees. Venture capitalists, corporate titans, and influential politicians shrank back into their gilded chairs, instinctively recognizing a predator at the absolute top of the food chain. I did not need to announce my net worth. The crisp cut of the Italian fabric, the immaculate gleam of the solid gold watch resting on my wrist, and the icy determination in my eyes communicated my status flawlessly. The air in the cavernous room grew incredibly heavy, stifling the breath of the high society audience. I locked my gaze directly on the elevated altar at the far end of the flower-lined aisle. Morgan stood frozen beside Ethan, her flawless makeup doing nothing to hide the sudden stark terror draining the color from her face. I took my first deliberate step forward. The sharp rhythmic strike of my polished leather shoes against the marble floor echoed like a metronome counting down the final seconds of her fabricated reality. I walked past rows of terrified guests who instinctively pulled their designer gowns and tailored legs out of my path. I did not look at any of them. My focus remained entirely locked on my daughter. Her mind violently rejected the visual evidence confronting her. She had meticulously paid $20,000 just hours earlier to guarantee my absence. She expected a broken, humiliated blue-collar worker cowering in the shadows. Instead, she watched a billionaire titan march confidently down the center of her perfect wedding. Panic completely overrode her carefully practiced sophistication. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice cracked, soaring into an ugly, shrill shriek that shattered the elegant ambiance of the venue. She frantically ordered the estate security guards to intervene immediately. She demanded they physically restrain the homeless intruder and throw the pathetic trespasser out into the freezing street. She screamed that I had clearly bypassed the perimeter gates and broken into the building to ruin her special day. Her desperate lies tumbled out in a chaotic, hysterical rush, exposing the vile core she had fought to conceal. The highly trained security personnel stationed along the perimeter of the Crystal Ballroom immediately mobilized. The head of security, a massive, imposing man wearing a tailored black suit and a coiled earpiece, marched briskly down the side aisle. Morgan let out a loud, breathless gasp of relief, fully expecting the large guard to tackle me to the marble floor and drag me out of sight. She watched with wide, triumphant eyes as the security chief closed the distance between us rapidly. However, the guard did not reach out to grab my shoulders. He did not draw his weapon or issue a stern verbal warning. Instead, he stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me, squared his broad shoulders, and snapped to absolute attention. He ignored her frantic, screeching commands completely. He planted his feet firmly and executed a deep, respectful bow right in the middle of the grand aisle. He raised his head and spoke into the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. His voice was incredibly clear and completely devoid of hesitation. He addressed me publicly as Mr. Chairman. He formally welcomed me to my own property and apologized profusely for any inconvenience regarding the disruption of the ceremony. The revelation struck the audience like a physical shockwave. The entire security apparatus recognized me. The elite guests gasped collectively, the realization rippling through the rows of gilded chairs like wildfire. The venture capitalists in the front rows recognized the corporate implications instantly. The invisible owner of the most exclusive, sprawling luxury estate in the state had just revealed himself. They were sitting inside a fortress that I owned outright. Her brain completely short-circuited. She stumbled backward, her high heels catching violently on the heavy silk hem of her custom wedding gown. She flailed her arms to maintain her balance, knocking over a towering arrangement of imported white orchids. The crystal vase shattered loudly against the marble altar. She could not comprehend the spectacular failure of her intricate deception. Her eyes darted wildly from the bowing head of security to my impassive face. Her chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths as her mind frantically searched for a logical explanation that simply did not exist. The man she had violently discarded as a worthless, destitute failure was actively commanding the highest level of respect from the very establishment she used to define her elite status. The fundamental laws of her meticulously constructed universe had just been permanently rewritten in front of hundreds of shocked people. She lost the last remaining shred of her sanity. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the polished wooden podium to keep herself upright. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know exactly where I had stolen the expensive Italian tuxedo and the solid gold watch. She accused me of robbing a wealthy man just to infiltrate her ceremony and humiliate her. Her accusations sounded entirely pathetic and completely unhinged to everyone in the room. The sophisticated facade had completely melted away, leaving only a terrified, cornered predator grasping at straws. Ethan stood silently beside her, watching her catastrophic breakdown with cold, calculating satisfaction. He did not offer her a single word of comfort or support. I continued my steady, relentless march forward, entirely unfazed by her hysterical outburst. I ascended the short flight of stairs leading to the elevated altar. I bypassed the stunned, trembling officiant without sparing him a single glance. I stopped exactly 12 inches away from Morgan. I looked down into her wide, terrified eyes, seeing the exact moment all her hope evaporated. I certainly did not offer her a warm, fatherly embrace. I did not speak a single word of comfort or forgiveness. Parental mercy officially expired the second she chose greed over her dying mother. I reached a slow, steady hand inside the tailored pocket of my midnight blue jacket. I wrapped my fingers around the thick, heavy manila envelope she had arrogantly delivered to my apartment that very afternoon. I pulled the package out, holding it up so the bright chandelier light caught the edge of the paper. Morgan stared at the envelope, her jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. She recognized it almost instantly. I flicked my wrist and tossed the heavy package directly at her trembling feet. The flap tore open upon impact, and the massive stack of crisp, untraceable $100 bills spilled out across the pristine marble floor. The $20,000 bribe she had used to purchase my absence now surrounded her pristine wedding dress. The crisp $100 bills settled over the pristine white train of her custom silk gown, lying like warning signs of her ultimate ruin. Morgan stared down at the scattered currency, her breath hitching sharply in her throat. She was completely incapable of producing a single coherent sound. The crystal ballroom remained paralyzed in absolute suffocating shock. I stepped past her trembling frame and walked directly to the polished podium. I took the microphone from Ethan. My hand brushed against his and we exchanged a brief confirming nod. The alliance we forged in my dilapidated apartment the night before was now fully operational. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy guests, venture capitalists, and political elites seated in the gilded chairs. The harsh glare of the cascading crystal chandeliers illuminated my face for the entire room to witness. I did not speak immediately. I let the sheer, crushing weight of the silence stretch out, forcing every single attendee to focus entirely on my presence. The air grew incredibly heavy. I raised the microphone and introduced myself to the assembly. I stated my full name, making sure the deep cadence of my voice echoed clearly off the marble walls and the gold-leafed ceilings. I watched the immediate wave of recognition crash over the front rows. Several prominent corporate board members gasped aloud, their eyes widening in sudden, profound realization. I informed the prestigious crowd that I was not the violent, destitute mechanic my daughter had meticulously described in her fabricated, tragic narratives. I announced that I was the primary shareholder of the holding company that owned the Grand Plaza estate. I told them I owned the sprawling botanical gardens, the private service corridors, the crystal ballroom, and the very marble floor they were sitting on. I watched the elite crowd process the devastating reality. The man Morgan had actively hidden away, the man she had paid $20,000 to banish from this estate, was the absolute sovereign of the venue. The head of security stood at strict attention by the side aisle, confirming my absolute authority to every doubting eye in the room. Morgan let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth as her brain desperately tried to assemble the shattered fragments of her false reality. She looked at Ethan silently, begging him to intervene to save her from the horrific public exposure. But Ethan did not rush to her side. He stepped up to the podium and stood shoulder to shoulder with me, presenting a unified front against her deception. He leaned toward the microphone and addressed his peers, his colleagues, and his family. He announced that his beautiful bride had spent months draining his operational capital into untraceable offshore accounts. The crowd erupted into sharp, scandalized whispers. Ethan raised his hand, demanding silence. He then delivered the ultimate crushing blow. He stated that I was the anonymous angel investor who had single-handedly saved his technology startup 5 years ago. He informed the entire assembly that the massive fortune Morgan was actively trying to steal was built entirely on the capital I had generously provided. He looked at Morgan with profound disgust and stated she had tried to erase the very man who funded the empire she sought to conquer. The irony was absolute and entirely devastating. Ethan stepped back, his posture rigid and his expression utterly devoid of any lingering affection. Morgan staggered backward, her high heels slipping dangerously on the scattered currency. She shook her head violently in denial. I stepped away from the podium and closed the physical distance between us. I stood towering over her trembling frame. I looked directly into her panicked, tear-filled eyes with absolute ice in my veins. I spoke clearly, ensuring my unamplified voice carried to the furthest corners of the silent ballroom. I reminded her of the intense, visceral disgust she displayed whenever she smelled motor oil on my hands during her childhood. I recalled the deep shame she projected whenever I dropped her off at her elite private high school in my rusted truck. I delivered the harsh truth she had conveniently chosen to ignore for her entire adult life. I told her that specific, pungent scent of motor oil was the direct result of grueling, agonizing double shifts. I explained that those brutal 80-hour work weeks paid every single cent of her exorbitant Ivy League tuition. I reminded her of the freezing winter mornings when I would wake up hours before dawn, my body aching from the previous day of labor, just to ensure her tuition check cleared the bank on time. I explained that her expensive textbooks, her pristine uniforms, and her seamless integration into a world of immense privilege were entirely subsidized by the dirt and grime she so thoroughly abhorred. She had completely rewritten her own history to cast me as a villain, maliciously erasing the endless nights Evelyn and I spent calculating our meager budget just to give her a chance at a superior life. She had traded genuine parental sacrifice for a hollow, superficial aesthetic that was completely devoid of any real substance. The brutal reality of her extreme entitlement and boundless greed hung heavily in the chilled air of the ballroom. Suddenly, the sharp, rhythmic click of heels against the polished marble floor broke the intense standoff. Ethan's mother, a formidable woman wrapped in elegant silver silk, marched directly up the stairs of the elevated altar. Her face was flushed with righteous maternal fury. She bypassed her son completely and stopped directly in front of Morgan. Ethan's mother did not utter a single word of reproach or disappointment. She simply raised her hand and delivered a resounding, explosive slap across Morgan's face. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous ballroom like a gunshot. Morgan cried out in pure shock, her hand flying to her stinging red cheek. She stumbled backward, her pristine veil catching on the shattered remains of the orchid vase. The physical strike served as the final definitive verdict for the assembled guests. The elite crowd stood up in absolute unison. The synchronized scraping of hundreds of gilded chairs against the polished marble signaled the absolute end of her reign. Venture capitalists, prominent socialites, and powerful politicians turned their backs on the altar without a shred of hesitation. They began walking out of the crystal ballroom in profound, unified disgust. The grand double doors remained wide open, swallowing the departing crowd as they swiftly evacuated the toxic spectacle. Morgan stood entirely alone on the elevated stage, surrounded by the scattered $100 bills and the ruined floral arrangements. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined by long, dark streaks of hot, panicked tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She reached out a desperately trembling hand toward the rapidly retreating figures, but no one turned back to offer her a single shred of comfort or sympathy. The resounding silence of the massive venue was absolutely deafening, a brutal testament to her sudden, complete isolation from the world she worshipped. She stared blankly at the empty, cold, echoing ballroom, finally realizing that her social annihilation was absolute, irreversible, and entirely of her own making. Segment 11. The Threat in the Ruins. The heavy oak doors clicked shut in the distance, sealing the crystal ballroom in a profound, suffocating silence. The sprawling space, previously humming with the elite chatter of Chicago high society, now felt entirely hollow. The scattered $100 bills rested like dead leaves across the polished marble floor, mocking the extravagant floral arrangements cascading from the gilded pillars. Morgan stood at the center of the elevated altar, surrounded by the physical wreckage of her shattered social ascension. She lowered her trembling hands from her face, and the breathless, terrified victim vanished completely. The hot tears drying on her pale cheeks gave way to a cold, venomous glare that hardened her features into an unrecognizable mask. She realized her theatrical performance held absolutely zero value for the two men remaining in the room. Ethan and I stood perfectly still, watching the rapid, terrifying transformation unfold. Her posture straightened, the fragile vulnerability evaporating into the chilled air. She kicked the shattered remains of the crystal orchid vase out of her way, her pristine silk wedding gown catching and tearing on the jagged shards. She bared her teeth in a vicious, animalistic snarl. The cornered predator finally revealed her true, unvarnished nature. She did not drop to her knees and beg for forgiveness. She did not attempt to apologize for stealing Ethan's operational capital. Instead, she launched a ferocious, highly calculated counterattack. Morgan stepped down from the altar, her high heels brutally grinding the crisp currency into the polished marble. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice echoed sharply through the cavernous hall, entirely stripped of its former manufactured sweetness. She declared that I had made a catastrophic, unforgivable miscalculation by exposing her in front of the city elite. She stated that humiliating her on her wedding day would cost me everything I had spent my entire life building. She reminded me of a critical, unavoidable legal reality that she planned to weaponize immediately. She was my only living relative. She was the sole biological heir to the massive corporate empire Evelyn and I had constructed in absolute secrecy. Morgan marched closer, her eyes blazing with an intoxicating mixture of blinding rage and unadulterated greed. She promised to drag my name through the most vicious, highly publicized litigation in the history of the state. She swore she would hire a legion of aggressive corporate attorneys to completely dismantle my holding companies piece by piece. She threatened to file immediate emergency injunctions citing profound emotional distress and severe financial deprivation. She boasted that a sympathetic judge would easily award her half of my global assets just to settle the explosive public scandal. She sneered at my midnight blue tuxedo, claiming my immense wealth was simply a temporary bank account waiting for her inevitable withdrawal. I listened to her desperate, shrieking threats without moving a single muscle or breaking eye contact. The sheer, unadulterated venom in her voice mirrored the exact darkness Evelyn had warned me about on her hospital bed 5 years ago. Morgan truly believed her vicious legal threats would invoke the same paralyzing terror she had witnessed in the eyes of her previous victims. She fully expected me to flinch to attempt a frantic negotiation or to offer a massive, immediate financial settlement to protect my strict corporate anonymity. I simply looked at her distorted face with absolute, unyielding indifference. The titan who commanded industries did not bargain with thieves. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic volume. I did not offer a single word of defense justification or retaliation. I simply raised my hands and slowly buttoned my tailored jacket. I adjusted my cuffs with deliberate precision, letting the heavy solid gold watch gleam under the cascading crystal chandeliers above us. I looked directly into her furious, panicked eyes and told her that a queen without a kingdom is simply a beggar standing in a stolen dress. I turned my back on her completely. I walked down the center of the long, flower-lined aisle with measured, confident strides. The sharp, rhythmic strike of my leather shoes echoed loudly, completely drowning out her frantic, escalating screams. I pushed open the massive oak doors and exited the grand ballroom of my own luxury estate. Ethan remained standing silently at the altar, a towering monument of cold realization. Morgan pivoted her intense fury toward him, desperately expecting to leverage his previous romantic affection. She demanded he fulfill his legal obligation to marry her immediately, screaming that his software startup would perish without her continued guidance. Ethan did not flinch, nor did he offer any comforting reassurances. He reached inside his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy leather folder. He dropped it forcefully onto the polished wooden podium, the heavy thud cutting through her hysterical ranting. The folder slid open to reveal a massive stack of forensic accounting documents, comprehensive banking logs, and digital wire transfer receipts, highlighting every single stolen dollar. He informed her in a perfectly flat, emotionless tone that his attorney Mitchell had officially executed the legal freeze on her offshore shell companies exactly 10 minutes ago. Federal banking authorities had completely locked her hidden accounts, severed her credit lines, and flagged her passport for international travel to prevent any possibility of escape. Every single dollar she had embezzled from his technology startup had been successfully identified and fully repatriated to his corporate accounts. He looked at her ruined wedding dress and stated with brutal clarity that she was absolutely destitute. Ethan turned his back on the screaming woman, descended the altar stairs, and walked out of the ballroom. The freezing Chicago rain returned with a severe vengeance later that night. Morgan sat shivering on the edge of a stained, sagging mattress inside a cheap, decaying motel on the industrial outskirts of the city. The harsh, flickering neon sign outside the single cracked window cast a sickly red glow over her ruined, dirt-stained silk wedding gown. Her pristine, high society life had been entirely decimated in a matter of hours. The doors to the luxury penthouse were permanently locked. Her premium credit cards were universally declined at every terminal. The elite friends who had praised her beauty earlier that morning now actively ignored her frantic, desperate phone calls. She clutched a cheap, disposable smartphone she had purchased with the few loose bills she managed to scrape together from her discarded designer purse. However, she blatantly refused to accept her absolute defeat. Her extreme, ingrained entitlement shielded her from experiencing any genuine remorse or self-reflection. She scrolled through a digital legal directory and dialed the personal number of a notoriously aggressive, highly unethical family law attorney. The man possessed a terrifying reputation for destroying corporate empires through relentless predatory litigation. He answered the phone on the fourth ring, his voice gruff and impatient. Morgan did not bother with pleasantries or formal introductions. She demanded he draft an emergency asset freeze against my primary holding company by tomorrow morning. She promised him an unprecedented percentage of the total settlement in exchange for his immediate ruthless intervention. She stared at the peeling wallpaper of the dingy motel room, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated vengeance. The trap had successfully stripped her of her stolen fortune, but it had also unleashed a highly motivated predator with absolutely nothing left to lose. She feverishly prepared to launch a massive, catastrophic legal war to rip my entire empire apart. The sun cut through the glass of the executive boardroom, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany table. Jameson stood by the window looking out over the Chicago skyline. The city moved with frantic energy below him. Inside the room, the silence was absolute. The oak doors clicked open, breaking the stillness. Mitchell stepped inside, holding a thick leather binder. The lead attorney wore his tailored charcoal suit, but his face carried an unprecedented grimness. He walked to the head of the table and placed the binder down with a thud. Jameson approached his advisor. Mitchell did not offer a greeting. He opened the binder and slid a stack of legal documents across the wood. The front page bore the letterhead of the notorious family law attorney Morgan had contacted. Jameson picked up the filing and read. The sheer audacity of the claims was staggering. Morgan was suing for extreme emotional distress, public defamation, and catastrophic psychological trauma. Her lawyer constructed a vindictive narrative portraying her as the tragic victim of a manipulative billionaire father who intentionally hid his wealth to inflict financial deprivation upon his child. The demands were astronomically greedy. She requested an emergency asset freeze on all of Jameson's holding companies. Furthermore, she demanded a retroactive trust fund calculated to include back pay for decades of perceived financial neglect totaling tens of millions of dollars. She intended to drag his empire through a sensationalized legal circus to extort a settlement. Jameson read the demands without a change in his expression. The titanium resolve he had forged easily absorbed the desperate legal strike. He dropped the legal filing back onto the table. He looked at Mitchell, expecting his attorney to lay out a counter-litigation strategy to crush the frivolous lawsuit. Mitchell, however, did not reach for his legal pad. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a secondary, thinner folder. He placed it next to the lawsuit. He looked directly at Jameson and stated that the lawsuit itself was a noisy distraction. The real issue was hidden entirely in the financial logistics of the legal filing. Mitchell opened the thin folder and spread highly classified banking records across the table. He explained that his specialized forensic accounting team had immediately initiated a deep background check on the opposing counsel the moment the emergency injunction was filed. They systematically tracked the initial retainer fee Morgan had paid to secure the notoriously aggressive lawyer. The payment was substantial, a massive upfront cash sum designed exclusively to guarantee immediate, relentless legal warfare. Jameson frowned deeply, immediately noting the logistical impossibility of the transaction. Ethan had successfully frozen all of Morgan's offshore shell companies and severed her premium credit lines the night before. She was entirely destitute when she fled the wedding venue. Mitchell tapped a perfectly manicured finger against a highlighted transaction log. He explained that Morgan had not used her own frozen corporate assets. She had successfully processed the massive retainer fee using a highly untraceable black market credit card. Jameson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing sharply as he scrutinized the complex routing numbers printed on the banking manifest. The transaction had been cleverly laundered through a sophisticated series of anonymous digital payment gateways designed specifically to completely mask the true identity of the account holder. But Mitchell's elite team possessed resources and capabilities far beyond the reach of standard legal investigators. They had violently dismantled the digital firewall and expertly traced the dark money back to its original physical origin. Mitchell slid the final document toward Jameson. It was a clear, unredacted printout of the original credit application used to successfully secure the illicit card on the dark web. Jameson looked at the name printed in stark black ink at the very top of the application. The air inside the executive boardroom instantly turned to solid ice. The primary name registered on the fraudulent account was Evelyn. Jameson stared directly at the paper, his highly analytical mind momentarily refusing to process the horrifying visual data. He slowly traced the 9 digits printed directly beneath the name. It was Evelyn's exact social security number. He checked the timestamp of the approved credit application. It had been officially processed and fully approved less than 6 months ago. Evelyn had been dead for over 5 years. The devastating reality of the brutal situation crashed down upon him with the unstoppable force of a collapsing building. Morgan had not merely stolen from her wealthy fiancé to fuel her arrogant lifestyle. She had actively committed severe identity theft against her own deceased mother. She had taken the sacred personal information of the selfless woman who had sacrificed absolutely everything for her and weaponized it to open fraudulent lines of credit in the criminal underworld. She was currently funding her vicious, highly publicized legal attack against him using the stolen identity of his dead wife. The silence in the sprawling boardroom stretched out, becoming completely suffocating and profoundly dangerous. Jameson did not shout in anger. He did not violently throw the heavy binder against the mahogany wall. The very last lingering trace of paternal hesitation, the tiny, stubborn fraction of a father's heart that still secretly hoped for his daughter's eventual moral redemption, evaporated entirely into the cold air. His eyes turned completely flat, entirely devoid of any residual warmth, lingering mercy, or familiar hesitation. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the absolute apex predator of the corporate world fully awakened from his dormant state. He had been genuinely willing to let her walk away with nothing but the cheap clothes on her back to learn the harsh, uncompromising lesson of poverty. He had been willing to let the freezing reality of severe financial consequence break her toxic entitlement. But this profound betrayal crossed a sacred, entirely unforgivable boundary. Using Evelyn's cherished memory as a disposable financial shield to successfully wage a war of pure greed was a terminal offense. The protective gloves were completely off. Jameson slowly closed the thin folder containing the horrific, undeniable evidence of her federal identity theft. He aligned the edges of the thick paper perfectly on the table. He looked up at Mitchell with unwavering intensity. He firmly instructed his attorney to contact Morgan's lawyer immediately. He ordered Mitchell to bypass all standard legal delays and schedule an emergency mediation meeting for the very next morning. He demanded the meeting take place on neutral ground, face to face. Mitchell nodded instantly, recognizing the highly dangerous calculating calm settling over his employer. Mitchell asked if they should prepare a settlement offer to lure her into the room, suggesting a minimal financial concession just to secure her signature on a binding non-disclosure agreement. Jameson slowly shook his head. The icy resolve in his deep voice carried absolute finality. He told Mitchell that there would be absolutely no negotiations, no financial settlements, and absolutely no mercy granted tomorrow. He was not going to pay her to simply go away quietly. He was going to use her own horrific crimes to completely obliterate her future. He fully intended to trap her in a windowless room and execute her social and legal destruction with total surgical precision. The mediation center occupied the entire 42nd floor of a prominent downtown high-rise. The glass-walled conference room offered a sprawling panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, a fitting battleground for the corporate slaughter about to unfold. Morgan sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table, her posture radiating an intensely manufactured arrogance. She had spent the last of her scraped-together cash on a sharp-tailored black blazer to project an image of invulnerable authority. She masked the profound desperation of her cheap motel reality behind a thick layer of cosmetic foundation and a cold, predatory smirk. Beside her sat Richard Vance, a notoriously vicious family law attorney whose entire career was built on extorting wealthy executives through the threat of catastrophic public scandals. Vance arranged his legal pads and thick manila folders with the practiced, aggressive efficiency of a seasoned extortionist. He checked his gold watch, exuding absolute confidence in his impending victory. Morgan leaned back in her leather executive chair, crossing her arms tightly. She genuinely believed her aggressive legal strategy had successfully cornered the billionaire titan. She anticipated a swift, highly lucrative settlement, completely convinced that her father would eagerly pay an exorbitant ransom simply to protect his cherished corporate anonymity and shield his empire from a brutal media circus. The heavy glass doors swung open. Jameson strode into the conference room, completely ignoring the customary formalities of a legal mediation. Mitchell walked precisely one step behind him, carrying a single, incredibly thin leather folio. Jameson wore a flawless charcoal suit that absorbed the harsh fluorescent lighting of the room. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, a blank, terrifying mask of absolute corporate sovereignty. He did not look at his daughter. He did not acknowledge her venomous smirk or the burning hatred in her eyes. He approached the mahogany table and remained standing, projecting a dominating physical presence that instantly suffocated the air in the room. Richard Vance stood up aggressively, buttoning his suit jacket. The lawyer immediately launched into his rehearsed predatory monologue. Vance did not bother with pleasantries or introductory negotiations. He aggressively outlined a devastating scenario involving leaked financial documents, highly publicized allegations of extreme emotional abuse, and a sensationalized media campaign designed exclusively to permanently destroy Jameson's holding company. Vance paced the length of the table, his voice rising in volume as he detailed the horrific psychological trauma his client had allegedly endured. Morgan watched her lawyer perform, her smirk widening into a grin of pure vindictive triumph. Vance slammed his hands down onto the polished wood, leaning directly toward Jameson. He delivered the ultimate, uncompromising ultimatum. He demanded exactly $50 million to be wired into a secure trust fund by the end of the business day. In exchange for this massive financial concession, Vance promised that Morgan would sign a binding, ironclad non-disclosure agreement and permanently, quietly disappear from Jameson's life. Vance explicitly threatened that if the funds were not transferred immediately, he would file the devastating lawsuit in open court the very next morning, ensuring the entire city witnessed the gruesome, fabricated details of Jameson's parental neglect. The lawyer crossed his arms, staring at the billionaire titan with a smug, expectant glare. He had executed this exact extortion tactic dozens of times against prominent executives, and the target always capitulated under the terrifying threat of total public ruin. Morgan uncrossed her arms and leaned forward eagerly, waiting for the inevitable surrender. She expected to see fear, hesitation, or frantic negotiation in her father's eyes. She expected him to instruct his attorney to immediately draft the settlement paperwork to stop the impending bleeding. Jameson did not flinch. He did not blink. The terrifying silence in the glass conference room stretched into a suffocating, agonizing eternity. The sheer crushing weight of his absolute indifference began to profoundly unnerve the aggressive attorney. Vance shifted his weight uncomfortably, his predatory confidence faltering slightly under the intense, icy glare of a man who clearly did not fear a single threat presented to him. Jameson reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. He did not produce a checkbook. He did not pull out a settlement agreement or a counteroffer. He withdrew a single encrypted titanium USB drive. He extended his arm and dropped the small metal device directly into the center of the sprawling mahogany table. The sharp metallic clink echoed loudly in the painfully silent room. Jameson spoke for the very first time since entering the high-rise building. His voice was incredibly low, vibrating with a dark, lethal authority that commanded absolute obedience. He instructed Vance to plug the encrypted drive into his secure laptop and view the true cost of his legal representation. Vance frowned deeply, glancing nervously at Morgan before looking back at the titanium drive. He hesitated, his sharp legal instincts screaming that the dynamic of the room had just violently shifted out of his control. Mitchell stepped forward and slid a piece of paper across the table containing the complex alphanumeric decryption password. The overwhelming tension in the room compelled the attorney to act. Vance slowly reached out, picked up the metallic drive, and inserted it into the side of his laptop. He typed the provided password with hesitant fingers. The decryption software ran for 3 agonizing seconds before a massive categorized directory of highly classified files populated his screen. Morgan watched her lawyer's face, her vindictive grin slowly faltering as the color completely drained from Vance's cheeks. The attorney clicked on the first designated folder. The screen instantly displayed comprehensive forensic accounting records, complete with digital wire transfer receipts, IP addresses, and communication logs. It was absolute, irrefutable proof of Morgan systematically embezzling massive sums of operational capital from Ethan's technology startup directly into her hidden offshore shell companies. Vance swallowed hard, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as his eyes darted across the damning financial evidence. But the true devastation was firmly contained within the second categorized folder. He clicked the icon with a severely trembling hand. A highly classified federal background check immediately populated the high-resolution display. It contained an unredacted copy of the black market credit card application Morgan had used to successfully pay Vance his massive upfront legal retainer just 12 hours ago. Vance stared at the specific 9-digit Social Security number printed clearly on the federal document. Directly beside the fraudulent application was a certified state-issued death certificate belonging to Evelyn. The notoriously aggressive attorney froze completely, a cold, paralyzing sweat rapidly breaking out across his forehead. The horrific realization struck him with the devastating, unavoidable force of a runaway freight train. His arrogant, demanding client had not simply stolen corporate funds from a naive technology executive. She had actively committed severe federal identity theft against her own deceased mother to secure his premium legal services. Vance stared blankly at the glowing screen, suddenly comprehending the catastrophic reality of his predicament. He had unknowingly accepted a massive payment completely funded by highly traceable felonious activity. He was now sitting in a glass room holding stolen money, making him an unwitting, fully documented accessory to a massive federal crime. Morgan noticed his silence and demanded to know what he was looking at. Richard Vance stared at the federal document brilliantly illuminated on his high-resolution laptop screen. The specific 9-digit Social Security number burned a permanent hole into his retinas. He had spent 20 arduous years building a ruthless, terrifying reputation in the vicious arena of Chicago family law. He specialized in aggressive corporate extortion and borderline unethical divorce settlements. He knew exactly where the rigid legal line was drawn. He had masterfully danced along that precarious boundary for decades without ever suffering a single professional consequence. But the highly classified banking records populating his screen were not a clever tactical maneuver or a gray area negotiation tactic. This was irrefutable, catastrophic evidence of a massive federal felony. Taking a retainer fee funded by embezzled capital was incredibly dangerous. Accepting a payment meticulously processed through a dark web node using the stolen identity of a deceased woman elevated the crime to an entirely different stratosphere. The federal banking authorities would not simply issue a mild sanction. They would immediately dispatch armed agents to his office. They would permanently revoke his license to practice law in every single state. They would aggressively seize his lucrative firm and freeze his personal assets. They would hand him a mandatory, inescapable federal prison sentence for international money laundering and conspiracy to commit severe wire fraud. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The smug, predatory confidence he had weaponized against Jameson just moments earlier vanished into the chilled, air-conditioned atmosphere. He looked up from the glowing screen and met the billionaire's icy gaze. He realized instantly that the titan sitting across the table had not come to negotiate a quiet settlement. Jameson had come to execute a flawless, fully documented legal slaughter. Vance knew he was staring at a carefully constructed, inescapable trap designed to permanently obliterate anyone standing in the blast radius. Morgan instantly noticed the sudden, terrifying shift in her attorney's demeanor. She slammed her manicured hands flat against the polished mahogany table and demanded to know exactly what he was staring at. She violently ordered him to close the laptop and immediately resume their extortion strategy to secure her retroactive trust fund. Vance ignored her shrill commands completely. He felt a cold sweat soaking through his undershirt. His hands shook violently as he reached forward and yanked the titanium drive from the USB port. He practically threw the encrypted device across the expansive wooden table toward Mitchell, treating it like a live explosive. Vance stood up so aggressively that his heavy leather executive chair skidded backward on the carpet and slammed loudly against the thick glass wall of the conference room. He began shoving his yellow legal pads and thick manila folders into his briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated haste. He did not care about the deep wrinkles forming on his expensive suit. He cared only about escaping the hazardous room before federal agents stormed the building to arrest him. Morgan stood up, her voice rising in sheer, escalating panic. She ordered him to sit down and finish the job she had paid him to do. She desperately reminded him of the unprecedented percentage she had promised him upon securing the settlement. Vance snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut with a sharp click. He looked at Morgan with an expression of absolute disgust. He stated with perfect, uncompromising clarity that he was formally and immediately withdrawing his legal representation. He informed her that he would be contacting the State Bar Association within the hour to officially sever all professional ties to her toxic case. He declared that she had paid him with stolen funds utilizing a fraudulent black market credit card registered to her dead mother. Morgan stumbled backward as if struck by a brutal physical blow. Her jaw dropped open in absolute shock. She stammered, desperately attempting to weave a brand new tapestry of lies to explain the stolen identity. She claimed there was a simple administrative misunderstanding with the banking routing numbers. She loudly insisted she could secure legitimate funds by the end of the week to keep him on retainer. Vance did not wait to hear her fabricated, pathetic excuses. He marched directly toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom. He knew any further association with this dangerous woman would guarantee his own total destruction. Morgan lunged forward, grabbing the sleeve of his jacket. She shrieked at him, demanding he stay and fight the billionaire. She desperately reminded him of his fierce reputation for destroying massive corporate empires. Vance ripped his arm away from her frantic grip with violent force. He told her she was completely delusional and operating outside of reality. He stated that Jameson possessed enough federal evidence to bury her in a maximum security prison for several decades. Vance pushed forcefully through the glass doors and sprinted down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators. Morgan screamed his name, her voice echoing violently through the pristine corporate corridor. She ordered him to come back and finish the negotiation. The heavy glass doors swung shut with a definitive sealing click. The precise engineered sound amplified the sheer totality of her sudden isolation. The panoramic view of the Chicago skyline suddenly felt less like a conquest and more like a towering prison. She was left entirely defenseless inside the boardroom. She turned around slowly, her high heels squeaking against the floor, facing the terrifying, inescapable reality of her current situation. She was trapped in a soundproof glass cage with the apex predator she had foolishly tried to extort. Morgan stared intensely at Jameson. The tailored black blazer she wore suddenly looked incredibly cheap against the backdrop of true corporate sovereignty. She realized her aggressive legal shield had been completely vaporized in less than 5 minutes. The $50 million extortion attempt was officially dead and buried. She backed away slowly until her trembling shoulders hit the cold glass wall of the boardroom. Her mind raced frantically, searching for a single remaining weapon in her decimated arsenal. Her extreme entitlement absolutely refused to accept total defeat. She dropped the facade of the terrified victim. Her perfectly contoured features twisted into a vicious snarl. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Jameson and launched a desperate threat. She declared that she did not need an expensive lawyer to systematically destroy him. She promised to walk directly out of the high-rise building and go straight to the largest media outlets in the city. She threatened to spin a sensationalized narrative about a ruthless, tyrannical billionaire who intentionally abandoned his struggling daughter to live in absolute poverty. She vowed to paint him as a cruel, heartless monster who hoarded his massive wealth in offshore accounts, while his only biological child suffered immensely in dangerous, rat-infested tenements. She swore the explosive public outrage would trigger a massive shareholder revolt, tank his corporate stock, and completely obliterate his pristine reputation in the global business world. Jameson did not flinch. He did not raise his voice to counter her desperate, shrieking threats. He slowly stood up from the mahogany table and smoothly buttoned his charcoal jacket. He looked at her with an incredibly cold, ruthless smile. He informed her that she would not have to walk far to find a sympathetic camera. He stated with absolute terrifying calm that the media was already waiting downstairs. Jameson turned away from the glass wall of the executive boardroom, leaving Morgan paralyzed by the sudden revelation. He walked into the polished corridor, his charcoal suit catching the muted light. Mitchell walked at his side, holding a digital tablet monitoring the live feeds from the ground floor. The high-speed elevator doors slid open. Jameson stepped inside, facing the closing steel doors. He watched the numerical display rapidly descend from the 42nd floor, feeling a profound sense of closure. He had spent decades guarding his identity, operating from the shadows to protect the family that ultimately betrayed him. Evelyn had always warned him that immense wealth attracted severe moral corruption. He had built his anonymous fortress specifically to shield their daughter from that toxic reality. His extreme caution had ultimately failed to save Morgan from her inherent greed. The elevator chimed softly, announcing their arrival. The polished doors slid apart, unleashing a blinding storm of camera flashes and chaotic voices. The massive marble lobby of the corporate headquarters had been transformed into a highly coordinated media circus. Dozens of premier journalists, financial correspondents, and national news anchors crowded tightly behind the velvet security ropes. High-definition television cameras formed a dense mechanical wall facing a single mahogany podium equipped with a cluster of broadcasting microphones. Jameson walked directly into the blinding barrage of camera flashes with absolute unwavering composure. The chaotic shouting of the journalists instantly died down the second he stepped behind the polished wood. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence commanded total, uncompromising silence. Jameson gripped the edges of the podium, looking out over the sea of camera lenses. He leaned into the microphones and formally introduced himself to the world. He stated his full name, confirming his identity as the sole architect and primary shareholder of the global holding company that dominated the city. He watched the journalists frantically typing on their tablets, rushing to document the unprecedented unmasking of the city's most elusive billionaire. Jameson did not allow the press to dictate the narrative. He maintained absolute control of the broadcast. He spoke clearly, his deep voice echoing through the marble lobby and streaming live across all major networks. He addressed the severe, sensationalized rumors that had begun circulating earlier that morning regarding his estranged daughter. Jameson looked directly into the primary news camera, his expression hardening into cold, unbreakable steel. He publicly dismantled Morgan's fabricated tragedy piece by piece. He informed the world that his daughter had not been abandoned to poverty, but had instead weaponized the immense privilege he secretly provided her. He detailed her malicious embezzlement of a prominent technology startup and her catastrophic decision to commit federal identity theft against her own deceased mother. The journalists gasped, audibly shocked by the brutal honesty of a corporate titan actively destroying his own bloodline on live television. Jameson stated with terrifying finality that Morgan possessed no legal standing within his empire. He publicly and permanently disowned her legally, severing all familial and financial ties completely. The media frenzy reached a fever pitch, but Jameson raised his hand, demanding a return to absolute silence. He announced that he had not gathered the national press merely to settle a vindictive family dispute. He came to dictate the permanent future of his vast financial empire. Jameson declared that he was officially transferring 99% of his total global assets into a newly established irrevocable trust. He explained that this massive fund was designed exclusively to provide unrestricted capital for underprivileged minority entrepreneurs operating in forgotten blue-collar neighborhoods. He reminded the silent crowd that he had started his own journey with grease on his hands and absolutely nothing in his bank account. He stated that true wealth belonged in the hands of those who possessed the grueling work ethic required to build something from the ground up, not in the manicured hands of entitled parasites. The transfer was legally binding, effective immediately, and entirely impervious to any future litigation. He stepped back from the podium, ignoring the sudden barrage of desperate questions from the reporters, and walked calmly toward the private executive exit. 42 stories above the chaotic lobby, Morgan stood completely frozen inside the glass-walled conference room. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table with bone-crushing force. She stared blankly at the massive digital monitor mounted on the boardroom wall. The high-definition screen broadcasted the live news feed with agonizing clarity. She watched her father stand at the podium and vaporize her entire existence. She listened to the brutal, undeniable public disownment echoing through the quiet room. Her chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths as the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic loss crushed the oxygen from her lungs. She witnessed the immediate, irreversible transfer of the multi-billion-dollar fortune into an impenetrable trust. The immense corporate empire she had ruthlessly planned to seize through vicious litigation was gone. The inheritance she believed was her absolute birthright had been permanently gifted to anonymous strangers. Her fabricated reality, her stolen elite status, and her aggressive extortion strategy burned to ash in real time. Morgan staggered backward, collapsing heavily into a leather executive chair. The digital monitor continued to broadcast the chaotic aftermath of the press conference, but the audio faded into a dull, ringing buzz inside her ears. Suddenly, the cheap disposable smartphone resting on the table vibrated violently. She reached out with trembling fingers and swiped the cracked screen. A rapid succession of automated text messages flooded her notifications. The dark web financial gateways she had utilized to secure her fraudulent credit line had been successfully compromised by federal authorities. Every single digital account associated with her stolen identity was instantly frozen. Her phone buzzed again, displaying a stark red notification from the cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The front desk had attempted to process her daily room charge, and the transaction had been decisively declined. She possessed absolutely zero accessible capital. She was stranded in the center of the city with nothing but a ruined wedding dress and impending federal indictments. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom opened behind her. Morgan did not have the strength to turn around. 2 towering security guards stepped into the room, their faces devoid of sympathy. The head of security walked directly to the mahogany table. He did not bow, nor did he offer her an ounce of professional courtesy. He looked down at the trembling, devastated woman and informed her that she was currently trespassing on private corporate property. He instructed her to stand up and vacate the premises immediately. Morgan tried to speak, attempting to summon the commanding tone she had weaponized just an hour earlier, but her throat was completely dry. Her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The towering security guards flanked her tightly, leaving no room for negotiation or delay. She slowly pushed herself out of the leather chair, her legs shaking violently under the immense weight of her total defeat. The guards escorted her out of the glass room, marching her silently down the polished corporate corridor toward the service elevators. She was thrown out into the freezing Chicago rain, entirely stripped of her false identity, facing inescapable ruin. The freezing rain that washed Morgan out of the corporate high-rise lasted 3 days. 2 weeks dragged by with agonizing slowness. Morgan's rapid descent from the absolute pinnacle of Chicago high society to the grimy depths of the streets was a masterclass in total isolation. Her highly publicized disownment acted as an impenetrable social quarantine. The elite friends who once fought for an invitation to her penthouse parties now actively threatened to call the police if she approached their gated communities. Every premium credit card was confiscated. The offshore accounts were seized by federal investigators building their massive criminal fraud case against her. She sold her tailored black blazer to a pawn shop just to afford a single night in a motel, but those meager funds evaporated instantly. She slept on hard plastic chairs in fluorescent-lit bus terminals, constantly moving to avoid aggressive security guards. The gnawing, physical ache of genuine hunger replaced her bottomless appetite for luxury. Her manicured nails chipped. Her perfectly styled hair became a tangled, greasy shield she used to hide her face from passing police cruisers. The city possessed no mercy for a fallen princess. She tried to leverage her extensive network dialing numbers from public payphones, but the response was universally cold. The corporate world had watched her father, the elusive billionaire titan, formally declare her toxic. Nobody dared cross Jameson by offering his disgraced daughter a lifeline. She was a total pariah, wandering the damp, unforgiving concrete with nothing but the clothes on her back and a burning, desperate rage that slowly mutated into raw panic. Driven by sheer desperation, her mind scoured her past for a single remaining resource. The luxury penthouses were locked. The bank vaults were federal crime scenes. The tech startup was completely insulated. She sat shivering on a damp park bench, staring at the glittering skyline she once believed she owned. A vivid memory pierced the fog of her exhaustion. She remembered the rundown apartment in the blue-collar district. She remembered the cramped bedroom where Jameson had lived as a struggling man. Most importantly, she remembered the heavy iron safe bolted to the floor in his closet. It was an antique mechanical vault with a thick combination dial. During rare visits to the cheap apartment, she had mocked him for keeping such an archaic security box. Jameson had simply smiled and stated that a man should keep a tangible reserve for true emergencies. Morgan's heart accelerated, pumping a sudden rush of adrenaline through her freezing body. Her extreme entitlement twisted the memory into a lifeline. If her father was a secret billionaire masquerading as a pauper, that heavy safe did not contain worthless trinkets. He likely kept a substantial reserve of physical cash or bearer bonds hidden inside the old apartment as a strategic contingency. He had abandoned the blue-collar facade after the press conference. The apartment was likely sitting empty, waiting to be cleared out by a real estate firm. It was the perfect target. She convinced herself taking the contents of the safe was not theft. She rationalized it as claiming her delayed inheritance, a final severance package from the man who had mercilessly destroyed her life. Morgan did not wait for the sun to rise. She pulled her stained jacket collar up and began the long trek toward the industrial outskirts of the city. The journey took hours. She navigated through unfamiliar neighborhoods, jumping at every sudden noise in the alleyways. The Silver Spoon heiress was forced to embrace the predatory instincts of a street scavenger. She found a heavy rusted steel crowbar discarded near a chain-link fence behind an auto mechanic shop. She gripped the cold metal tightly, feeling a strange empowerment. She was no longer trying to manipulate the legal system. She was going to smash her way to survival. The dilapidated apartment building loomed at the end of a dead-end street. The cracked brick facade and flickering yellow streetlights felt incredibly foreign to a woman accustomed to marble lobbies and crystal chandeliers. Morgan slipped silently through the broken security gate and crept up the narrow, creaking wooden stairwell. She reached the 3rd floor and stopped at the peeling wooden door. She expected a heavy security system, but the door featured only a standard aging deadbolt. She wedged the sharp, flattened edge of the rusted crowbar firmly between the doorframe and the metal lock. She threw her entire body weight against the heavy steel tool. The aging wood splintered violently with a sharp cracking sound. The deadbolt gave way. Morgan pushed the door open and slipped inside the pitch-black apartment, pulling the damaged door shut behind her to conceal the break-in. The apartment air was stale, carrying the scent of old paper and cheap coffee. The darkness was nearly absolute save for the weak amber glow of a distant street light filtering through the dusty living room blinds. Morgan moved with desperate urgency, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She navigated the cramped hallway entirely by memory, gripping the heavy crowbar tightly in her right hand. She bypassed the kitchen and stepped directly into the primary bedroom. The room was perfectly silent. She moved toward the open closet, dropping to her knees on the faded carpet. Her hands frantically swept across the floor until her fingers struck the freezing solid iron of the antique safe. A wave of euphoric relief washed over her. The heavy vault was exactly where she remembered it. She traced the cold metal edges, feeling the thick combination dial in the center. She did not know the numerical code, but she possessed the brutal force required to shatter the aging hinges. Morgan shifted her weight, finding her footing in the cramped darkness. She raised the heavy steel crowbar high above her head, her muscles tensing as she prepared to bring the weapon down with maximum destructive velocity. She anticipated the loud crunch of metal, the yielding of the iron door, and the glorious sight of bundled cash. The harsh, brilliant glare of the overhead lights snapped on instantly, flooding the bedroom with blinding illumination. Morgan gasped sharply, dropping the crowbar mid-swing. The heavy steel tool hit the floorboards with a deafening metallic crash. She threw her hands up to shield her dilated eyes from the sudden, aggressive light. As her vision rapidly adjusted to the sudden brightness, the absolute horror of her situation materialized in front of her. Jameson was not sleeping in a luxury penthouse downtown. He was sitting directly across the room in a worn, faded fabric armchair perfectly positioned in the corner. He wore a simple dark sweater and slacks projecting a calm, immovable dominance. He was holding a steaming ceramic cup of black coffee, casually resting his forearms on his knees. He did not shout for the police or demand an explanation for the shattered front door. He simply sat in the quiet room sipping his coffee, watching his biological daughter kneel on the floor with a burglary tool. The titanium titan who commanded global markets looked down at the shivering, filthy woman clutching his safe. Jameson lowered the ceramic cup and looked at Morgan with an expression of absolute, unadulterated pity. The heavy steel crowbar slipped from Morgan's trembling fingers. It struck the faded hardwood floor with a deafening metallic clang that reverberated violently against the bare walls of the cramped bedroom. She remained frozen on her knees, her wide, bloodshot eyes locked onto the towering figure of her father sitting perfectly still in the worn fabric armchair. The blinding overhead lights cast harsh shadows across her ruined designer clothing and matted hair. Jameson did not move a single muscle. He simply held the steaming ceramic cup of black coffee, letting the silence stretch out into a suffocating, agonizing eternity. He looked down at the pathetic, cornered predator kneeling in the dust, offering her absolutely nothing but profound, unadulterated pity. That specific look of pity accomplished what total financial ruin had failed to do. It completely shattered the fragile remnants of her manufactured composure. The initial paralyzing shock rapidly mutated into an explosive, uncontrollable rage. Morgan scrambled backward against the sliding closet doors, her breathing turning into ragged, furious gasps. She refused to accept the reality of her total defeat. She refused to acknowledge the grotesque criminality of breaking into her father's home with a weapon. Instead, she weaponized her sheer desperation, twisting her catastrophic failure into a vicious, highly calculated attack. Morgan pushed herself up from the floor, her high heels scraping aggressively against the worn carpet. She pointed a shaking, dirt-stained finger directly at Jameson's chest. Her voice tore through the quiet apartment, escalating into a hysterical, piercing scream. She declared that he was the sole architect of this entire catastrophe. She blamed him entirely for forcing her to live a suffocating double life for decades. She shrieked that his pathological obsession with corporate anonymity had actively tortured her every single day. She knew they possessed unimaginable, limitless wealth, yet he forced her to attend public schools, drive second-hand vehicles, and pretend to be part of the unremarkable working class. She screamed that he had selfishly trapped her in a pathetic blue-collar prison while he quietly commanded a global financial empire from the shadows. She accused him of deliberately withholding her rightful royal status, claiming he enjoyed watching her struggle to fit in with ordinary people when she was explicitly born to dominate high society. Her face twisted into a grotesque mask of absolute fury as she demanded to know why he had intentionally deprived her of the immense power, commanding influence, and limitless luxury that rightfully belonged to her by blood and absolute birthright. Jameson remained seated in the armchair, his expression an impenetrable fortress of cold steel. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his black coffee, the dark liquid matching the freezing temperature of his eyes. He did not offer a single syllable of defense. He did not attempt to justify his parenting decisions or explain the crucial necessity of building character before inheriting immense power. His total, unwavering silence acted as a powerful accelerant to her burning hysteria. Morgan paced the narrow space between the bed and the closet, her gestures becoming increasingly manic and unhinged. She spat out her intense hatred for the modest lifestyle he had meticulously constructed. She screamed that she despised the cheap vacations, the strict budgets, and the constant infuriating lectures about the fundamental value of a hard-earned dollar. She declared that his entire philosophy was nothing but a toxic delusion designed exclusively to keep her weak, compliant, and subservient. She felt absolutely zero remorse for embezzling from Ethan's technology startup. She felt zero guilt for utilizing a fraudulent black market card. She genuinely believed she was simply reclaiming the massive fortune her father had maliciously stolen from her the exact moment she was born into this world. The venom pouring from her mouth rapidly turned toward a sacred, highly dangerous target. Morgan pivoted sharply, her eyes blazing with absolute malice. She targeted the precious memory of the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her. Morgan shrieked that she despised Evelyn. She screamed that she hated her mother for constantly preaching the outdated virtues of humility, grace, and tireless hard work. She aggressively mocked Evelyn's gentle nature, calling her weak, pathetic, and entirely devoid of any genuine ambition. Morgan declared that Evelyn was a foolish, naive woman who actively chose to live exactly like a peasant despite having direct access to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. She shouted that she was disgusted by Evelyn's constant, desperate attempts to teach her genuine compassion and human empathy. Morgan bared her teeth in a vicious, animalistic snarl, proudly announcing that she was meant for absolute greatness, untouchable corporate power, and supreme global dominance. She stated that she had always seen through Evelyn's pathetic moral lectures. Using her dead mother's social security number to fund a ruthless legal attack was not a devastating tragedy to Morgan. She proudly declared it was the ultimate necessary financial correction. She viewed Evelyn's identity solely as a disposable financial asset, a basic stepping stone to finally secure the extravagant kingdom she had been violently denied. Jameson sat perfectly still. The steaming ceramic cup in his hands did not register a single tremor. He listened to the horrific desecration of his late wife's beautiful memory without breaking eye contact for a fraction of a second. The highly analytical corporate titan absorbed every single venomous word, processing the sheer, unadulterated darkness radiating directly from his only biological daughter. He had spent the last 2 grueling weeks quietly monitoring her rapid descent into severe poverty, secretly hoping the harsh reality of the unforgiving streets might spark a tiny fraction of genuine remorse or basic self-reflection. He had purposefully left the apartment unlocked and the antique iron safe entirely visible specifically as a final definitive test of her underlying character. He had intentionally given her one last opportunity to simply walk away or ask for honest help. Instead, she had deliberately arrived in the absolute dead of night armed with a heavy steel crowbar, fully prepared to violently shatter his vault and steal whatever meager emergency funds she believed he possessed. The brutal, unhinged verbal attack on Evelyn was the absolute confirmation he required. The final trace of paternal hesitation evaporated instantly into the freezing air of the bedroom. The compassionate man who had quietly hoped for his daughter's eventual redemption officially died in that worn fabric armchair. The titanium apex predator completely took his place. There was zero humanity left inside Morgan to salvage. She was a fully formed, remorseless monster. Jameson slowly lowered his ceramic coffee cup onto the small side table. He stood up with terrifying precision, towering over the screaming woman. He adjusted his dark sweater, his eyes locking onto her panicked face with absolute freezing finality. He looked down at her and stated in a dangerously flat, vibrating tone that she was completely correct. He agreed that she was never meant for an ordinary, unremarkable existence. He agreed she was meant for a vastly different life. Jameson reached into his deep pocket and withdrew his encrypted smartphone. He maintained intense, unbreakable eye contact as he deliberately pressed a single button on the screen. Heavy synchronized footsteps immediately began echoing loudly down the dark hallway outside the splintered apartment door. The synchronized footsteps stopped outside the splintered apartment door. The damaged wood was pushed open with uncompromising force, revealing the dark hallway. Two towering figures stepped over the threshold, their broad shoulders instantly crowding the cramped entrance. They were federal agents clad in dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across their chests. The harsh overhead light caught the metallic gleam of the gold shields clipped to their belts. They did not look at Jameson, who remained perfectly still by the worn armchair. Their hardened professional gazes locked immediately onto Morgan, who was still kneeling on the faded carpet beside the heavy iron safe. The paralyzing silence was instantly shattered by the booming voice of the lead agent. He stated her full legal name with a clinical detachment that carried the devastating weight of the federal government. He instructed her to keep her hands completely visible and to carefully step away from the antique vault. Morgan remained frozen, her bloodshot eyes darting frantically between the two armed officers and the cold, unyielding face of her father. The absolute reality of the trap crystallized. Jameson had not been hiding in this apartment to protect a stash of emergency cash. He had meticulously orchestrated this exact scenario, utilizing her own predictable bottomless greed to draw her directly into a federal ambush. The agents advanced into the room with tactical precision, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. The second agent unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. The metallic rattling sound cut through the stale air, sharp and terrifying. The lead agent began to recite her Miranda rights in a rapid, monotonous cadence that signaled the absolute end of her elite existence. He informed her that she was being placed under immediate federal arrest. He listed the specific devastating charges that would permanently lock her away from society. The agent declared she was being formally indicted for multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, citing the massive illegal transfer of operational capital from Ethan's software startup into offshore shell companies. He continued without pausing, adding the charge of grand larceny for the sheer volume of stolen wealth. Finally, he delivered the most catastrophic blow. He announced a severe federal indictment for aggravated identity theft, explicitly detailing her malicious, calculated use of a deceased citizen's social security number to secure fraudulent lines of credit in the criminal underworld. The mention of Evelyn's stolen identity hung heavily in the freezing room, a stark, undeniable testament to Morgan's supreme moral bankruptcy. The staggering weight of the combined federal charges guaranteed a mandatory, inescapable prison sentence spanning several decades. There would be absolutely no bail, no elite legal defense team, and no miraculous corporate bailout. Her pristine high society life had been entirely reduced to a list of severe felonies read aloud in a rundown blue-collar tenement. The last remnants of Morgan's manufactured arrogance instantly evaporated completely, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed forward onto the dusty carpet, her ruined clothes tangling around her trembling limbs. The vicious, calculating predator, who had just spent 10 minutes desecrating her mother's memory, vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic, hysterical child. She scrambled toward Jameson, her manicured hands grasping desperately at the fabric of his dark slacks. She shrieked for him to stop the agents, to use his immense corporate power to call off the arrest. She begged him to pay whatever massive financial penalty the federal government required, screaming that a billionaire titan could easily afford to simply erase this entire situation. She looked up at his face, hot tears streaming down her pale, foundation-stained cheeks, and weaponized the one word she believed still held power over him. She screamed the word "Dad" over and over again, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. She pleaded for paternal mercy, desperately attempting to invoke the sacred biological bond she had spent her entire adult life actively exploiting and systematically destroying. She promised to change, swore she would accept any strict conditions he demanded, and frantically offered to sign any legal document surrendering her inheritance if he would just prevent the agents from placing the steel cuffs on her wrists. The pathetic, shrieking display of absolute desperation echoed off the bare walls, a pathetic symphony of total defeat. Jameson did not step back, nor did he reach down to comfort the weeping woman clutching his legs. He looked down at her with an expression of absolute freezing indifference. The titan of industry viewed her not as his flesh and blood, but as a neutralized threat. He let her frantic, tearful pleas hang in the air for a long moment before delivering his final lethal response. His deep voice resonated with terrifying calm, completely devoid of any lingering paternal warmth. He firmly instructed her to stop using that word. He looked directly into her panicked, streaming eyes and coldly reminded her of a specific defining transaction from their past. He stated with brutal, uncompromising clarity that she had explicitly demanded and accepted $20,000 in cash to permanently walk away from his life. He reminded her that she had treated their biological relationship as a cheap, disposable commodity, happily accepting a financial payout to legally and emotionally sever their connection so she could pursue her toxic ambitions unhindered. Jameson informed her that the transaction was entirely complete. He stated that he had purchased his absolute freedom from her endless greed, and a man of his immense corporate stature never renegotiated a finalized contract. He told her that he was no longer her father, and she was simply a convicted felon trespassing in his old apartment. He turned his gaze away from her completely and nodded silently to the federal agents. The agents stepped forward immediately, gripping Morgan by her arms and forcefully hauling her up. She thrashed violently against their hold, her high heels kicking wildly as she shrieked in sheer panic. The cold steel handcuffs snapped around her wrists with a sharp, definitive click, locking her arms tightly behind her back. The physical restraint broke her completely. Her frantic negotiations devolved into guttural, incoherent screams. The agents marched her backward out of the bedroom, hauling her through the dark, cramped hallway. Morgan twisted her head back, her eyes wide with absolute horror, screaming Jameson's name as they dragged her over the threshold. Her hysterical cries echoed violently down the narrow wooden stairwell, bouncing off the peeling brick walls. Jameson stood perfectly still in the center of the bedroom, listening as the frantic shrieking gradually faded into the freezing Chicago night, eventually swallowed entirely by the distant wail of a police siren. The apartment fell into a profound, heavy silence. The toxic infection that had plagued his life had been surgically removed. He picked up his ceramic coffee cup, walked out of the bedroom, and stepped into the hallway. He paused at the splintered doorframe, looking around the small empty space that had witnessed both his grueling beginnings and his ultimate liberation. Jameson stepped out onto the landing, pulled the damaged wooden door shut, and drove the heavy deadbolt home, permanently locking the apartment and securing the absolute final severance of his past. 6 months dissolved into the steady, unrelenting rhythm of progress. The federal justice system operated with mechanical efficiency that mirrored Jameson's corporate philosophy. The trial concluded swiftly. Faced with irrefutable digital evidence wiretaps and banking logs detailing massive corporate embezzlement and identity theft, Morgan's public defender advised an immediate guilty plea. She received a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal correctional facility. The sensationalized media frenzy surrounding the disgraced heiress burned out rapidly, replaced by the relentless churn of the daily news cycle. The billionaire titan who orchestrated her downfall vanished from the headlines, retreating back into the fortified sanctuary of his holding company. However, the shadows he once operated from were permanently dispelled. He no longer hid his vast fortune or true identity. Jameson sat behind the expansive glass desk in the penthouse suite of his corporate headquarters. The corner office offered a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline bathed in crisp morning sunlight. The environment stood in stark contrast to the dark tenement apartment where he executed his final paternal severance. The heavy mahogany walls were gone, replaced by modern steel luminous glass and absolute transparency. Jameson adjusted his tailored navy suit jacket and focused his analytical mind on the stack of digital tablets arranged across his desk. He was personally reviewing candidate submissions for the inaugural class of his newly established philanthropic trust. The irrevocable transfer of 99% of his global assets launched the largest minority youth technology fund in the state. He read through essays, financial projections, and software proposals submitted by brilliant, underprivileged entrepreneurs from the forgotten districts of the city. He saw his own grueling beginnings reflected in their hungry ambition. He saw the raw potential he had relentlessly tried and failed to cultivate in his biological daughter. The heavy glass doors of the penthouse office swung open. Mitchell stepped into the sunlit room, offering a respectful nod before stepping aside to allow a visitor to enter. Ethan walked through the doorway carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. The young technology executive looked profoundly different from the devastated man who had stood at the altar of the Crystal Ballroom 6 months ago. The naive optimism Morgan ruthlessly exploited was entirely gone. In its place, Ethan radiated a tempered, hardened confidence. He had spent the last half-year stabilizing his software startup, recovering the repatriated funds, and meticulously rebuilding his operational infrastructure without the highly toxic influence of a parasitic partner. Jameson gestured toward the leather chair opposite his desk. He maintained a deep, silent respect for the young, resilient CEO. They were bound by the shared trauma of surviving the exact same hurricane. They had both stared directly into the dark abyss of Morgan's unadulterated greed and emerged with their respective empires intact. Ethan sat down and opened his briefcase. He did not offer empty pleasantries or dwell on the painful history they shared. He matched Jameson's strictly professional demeanor, operating with the sharp efficiency of a seasoned executive. Ethan withdrew a thick leather-bound document and slid it across the smooth, pristine glass surface of the desk. He looked directly into the older man's eyes and stated that he was not visiting to seek a financial handout or request a charitable corporate bailout. He was visiting to pitch a comprehensive, mutually beneficial partnership. Ethan outlined his vision with remarkable clarity and surgical precision. His software company had developed a revolutionary educational platform designed to streamline advanced coding architecture. He proposed fully integrating his proprietary software directly into the operational framework of Jameson's philanthropic trust. The unprecedented merger would create an elite, fully funded technological incubator. Ethan leaned forward, his voice vibrating with very genuine passion. He detailed a highly structured curriculum designed to actively recruit underprivileged minority students straight out of the most neglected high schools in the city. The partnership would provide these forgotten teenagers with state-of-the-art hardware, immersive software engineering mentorship, and the critical operational capital required to launch their own independent startups. Ethan argued that supplying financial grants was simply not enough to overcome the massive systemic barriers built into the corporate world. The students needed practical, hands-on experience navigating the vicious complexities of the tech industry. They needed absolute protection from predatory investors and opportunistic parasites waiting to exploit their raw talent. Ethan promised to personally oversee the educational integration, offering his own company as a secure testing ground for the brightest minds in the program. He wanted to build an impenetrable ecosystem where genuine ambition was rewarded with legitimate success, effectively bypassing the elitist corporate gatekeepers of high society. Jameson listened to the extensive, detailed pitch without interrupting a single syllable. He analyzed the financial projections, logistical deployment models, and risk mitigation strategies outlined in the document. The business model was absolutely flawless, completely airtight in its legal execution, and staggering in its philanthropic scope. But Jameson was not primarily focused on the impressive profit margins or the projected societal impact. He was intensely focused on the young man sitting across from him. He watched the fire of genuine, uncorrupted ambition burning brightly in Ethan's eyes. He recognized a man driven by profound integrity, operating from a place of deep moral conviction rather than bottomless, entitled greed. Ethan possessed the exact fundamental character traits that Evelyn had spent her entire life trying to impart to the world. He understood the sacred value of hard work, the critical importance of humility, and the moral obligation to elevate those struggling at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The silence in the penthouse office stretched out for a long, contemplative moment. The distant hum of the bustling city below provided a steady soundtrack to the monumental shift occurring within the glass walls. Jameson closed the thick proposal binder and aligned it perfectly with the edge of his desk. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a heavy, solid gold fountain pen. He uncapped the pen with a sharp, decisive click. He did not summon a team of corporate lawyers to draft a counteroffer or negotiate a more favorable equity split. He looked directly at Ethan and stated that the terms were entirely acceptable. Jameson pressed the gold nib against the signature line of the final page and executed his signature with bold, sweeping strokes. He slid the fully executed contract back across the glass desk. Jameson stood up, extending his hand toward the young executive. Ethan stood to meet him, grasping the billionaire's hand in a firm, resolute shake. The physical transaction sealed a profound, unbreakable alliance. It was a formidable partnership forged entirely in the fires of mutual respect, unyielding integrity, and a powerful shared vision for the future. As Jameson looked at the young man who had once almost become his son-in-law, a profound sense of absolute peace finally settled over his hardened soul. The agonizing void left by the violent severance of his toxic biological tie was completely filled. He had successfully built a fortress of wealth, survived the ultimate betrayal of his own flesh and blood, and discovered the true meaning of legacy. The empire Evelyn had envisioned was secure, protected by men who truly understood the price of their power. The sprawling metropolis of Chicago slowly dissolved in the rearview mirror of Jameson's armored sedan. He navigated the quiet, winding roads leading toward the city limits, leaving the towering glass citadels of the financial district far behind him. The chaotic symphony of blaring horns and rushing traffic faded into a profound meditative silence. He drove the vehicle entirely alone. He did not require the presence of a security detail or a personal chauffeur for this specific journey. The monumental partnership he had finalized with Ethan earlier that afternoon still resonated deeply within his mind. He felt a profound shift in his own internal gravity. The relentless heavy burden of protecting a deceitful biological heir had been permanently lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer expending his vast energy attempting to shield an ungrateful child from the brutal consequences of her own staggering arrogance. He had successfully redirected the immense power of his corporate empire toward a genuinely righteous cause. The transition felt remarkably physically liberating. He watched the urban landscape shift from dense commercial grids to open, manicured green spaces. The sky began to burn with the vibrant, vivid colors of late evening casting long golden shadows across the asphalt. He guided the heavy vehicle through the towering iron gates of the estate cemetery, the tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel pathways. The sprawling memorial grounds were completely deserted, offering a stark, tranquil contrast to the ruthless corporate battlegrounds he dominated daily. Ancient oak trees stood as silent sentinels over the sprawling, manicured lawns. Jameson parked the sedan near a familiar gentle hill overlooking a serene reflection pond. He stepped out into the crisp, cooling evening air, pulling his charcoal suit jacket tightly against the fading warmth of the setting sun. He reached into the passenger seat and retrieved a large, immaculate bouquet of fresh white lilies. They were Evelyn's favorite flowers. He carried them with quiet reverence, walking slowly up the sloping green incline. His expensive leather shoes stepped over the perfectly trimmed grass until he reached the crest of the hill. He stopped before a flawless, polished slab of black marble. The engraved silver lettering caught the dying sunlight, spelling out Evelyn's name with enduring grace. Jameson stood perfectly still, letting the absolute tranquility of the sacred space wash over his hardened exterior. He knelt slowly, his knees pressing into the soft earth, and gently placed the vibrant white lilies directly against the cold, dark stone. He arranged the delicate petals with meticulous care, ensuring they rested perfectly at the base of the monument. He traced his fingers over the engraved letters of her name, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of clarity. The turbulent, agonizing storm of the past 6 months was officially over. Jameson remained kneeling on the grass, looking directly at the polished marble. He began to speak to the empty air, his deep voice carrying a quiet, resonant strength that filled the peaceful silence of the cemetery. He told Evelyn that their legacy was finally secure. He explained that the immense, unprecedented fortune they had suffered and sacrificed to build was no longer at risk of being squandered by toxic entitlement. He spoke with brutal, unwavering honesty about the catastrophic choices their daughter had deliberately made. He did not sugarcoat the horrific reality of Morgan's federal conviction or the terrifying depths of her unadulterated greed. He confessed that severing the biological tie was the most excruciating action he had ever executed in his entire life. However, he firmly assured the Silent Stone that the drastic measure was absolutely necessary. He utilized a harsh but undeniable truth, telling Evelyn that he was forced to ruthlessly cut away the spreading rot so the foundational tree could actually survive. He explained that allowing Morgan to consume their legacy would have been a fundamental betrayal of everything Evelyn had ever stood for. He stated that the brutal amputation of their diseased bloodline was the only logical method to preserve the integrity of their immense sacrifices. He felt no residual guilt for allowing the federal justice system to permanently cage the monster she had become. Jameson stood up slowly, brushing the damp earth from the fabric of his trousers. He looked down at the vibrant lilies resting against the black marble and continued his quiet confession. He told his late wife about the remarkable young man who had stepped into the massive void left by their daughter's incarceration. He described Ethan's unwavering integrity, his sharp technological brilliance, and his genuine, uncorrupted dedication to uplifting the forgotten communities of the city. He explained the massive philanthropic trust he had established and the revolutionary educational partnership he had just formally cemented. He assured Evelyn that her deeply held beliefs in fundamental human compassion and honest, grueling hard work were currently becoming a permanent institutional reality. The vast fortune they had guarded in secret was now actively dismantling the systemic barriers that held back brilliant, underprivileged minds. He told the empty air that the young minority engineers benefiting from their wealth would carry Evelyn's magnificent spirit forward, into the next generation. They would build the brilliant future she had always dreamed of. Jameson felt a deep, enduring peace settle permanently into his bones. The agonizing chapter of deception, corporate espionage, and family betrayal was decisively closed. He had successfully transformed a profound personal tragedy into a monumental societal victory. The legacy was safe, completely untouchable by greed or corruption. The brilliant orange and purple hues of the sunset began to fade into a deep, bruised twilight. The ambient temperature dropped sharply, but Jameson did not feel the cold. He stood in absolute silence for several long minutes, simply existing in the sacred, tranquil presence of the extraordinary woman who had permanently anchored his entire moral compass. He offered one final, highly respectful nod to the polished black marble monument and turned away from the grave. He walked slowly back down the manicured green hill toward his waiting armored sedan. His posture was perfectly straight, radiating an undeniable, majestic authority that commanded the quiet space. As he approached the heavy vehicle, he stopped and looked out over the vast, glittering skyline of the city illuminating the distant horizon. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the dying light, standing as a physical testament to his immense journey. He was no longer the exhausted, disrespected mechanic hiding his true capabilities in a rundown urban tenement. He was no longer a silent, passive victim absorbing the relentless, toxic abuse of a parasitic child who believed she was untouchable. He was the undisputed master of his own fate. He gripped the door handle of his car, realizing a profound, ultimate truth that would define his remaining years. He understood with absolute crystalline clarity that true power was never simply about possessing limitless financial wealth or dominating global markets. True power was possessing the unwavering, unbreakable discipline to never let anyone dictate your fundamental worth. He opened the heavy car door and slipped inside the quiet cabin. The engine roared to life with a smooth, powerful hum. He drove away from the incredibly silent cemetery, leaving the dark past behind him forever. The screen fades to absolute black.